The hushed conversations and polite laughter filled the high-ceilinged ballroom of the Veteran Affairs Building in downtown Boston, a symphony of political niceties and forced camaraderie. Men in expensive suits mingled with uniformed officers, their chests adorned with medals that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers. It was the annual Veterans Recognition Gala, where those who had served were supposedly honored for their sacrifice. At least, that was what the banner hanging above the stage proclaimed. Marcus Washington stood near the back of the room, his weathered hands clasped around a glass of water. The dark blue suit he wore had been purchased specifically for this event, and though it fit him perfectly, he couldn't help but feel out of place. Unlike many of the other attendees, Marcus wore no medals, no pins, nothing to advertise his service. The only physical reminder of his time in the military was hidden beneath his sleeve, a small, curved scar on his right forearm that resembled a crescent moon. He had come tonight at the insistence of his daughter, Tanya, who worked for one of the event's sponsors. "You need to get out more, Dad," she had said, her voice gentle but firm. "Meet some of the other vets. It might help." Marcus had nodded, not wanting to disappoint her, though he knew better. These gatherings weren't for men like him, men who had served in the shadows, whose names never made it into the official reports, whose sacrifices remained classified decades later. Marcus took a small sip of his water, his dark eyes scanning the room. The majority of the attendees were white, with a sprinkling of other ethnicities here and there. He had grown used to being the only black face in spaces like this, but the feeling of being an outsider never quite faded. A waiter passed by, offering hors d'oeuvres that Marcus politely declined. He wasn't here to enjoy himself. He was here because he had promised Tanya, and if there was one thing Marcus Washington still believed in, it was keeping his promises. "First time at one of these events?" a voice asked, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. Marcus turned to find a middle-aged white man in a navy suit standing beside him, a friendly smile on his face. The man extended his hand. "Richard Bailey. I'm with the Veterans Outreach Program." Marcus shook his hand, his grip firm. "Marcus Washington." "Which branch did you serve in, Marcus?" Richard asked, taking a sip from his champagne flute. There it was, the question Marcus had been dreading. He had prepared for it, of course, had rehearsed the answer that was both true and vague enough to avoid further inquiry. "Army," Marcus replied, his voice even. "Long time ago." Richard nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. "Vietnam?" Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Something like that." Before Richard could press further, they were interrupted by the sound of tapping on a microphone. The crowd's attention shifted to the stage, where a distinguished-looking man in his 60s stood at the podium. Senator James Harrington, a vocal advocate for veterans' rights, or so his campaign materials claimed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the senator began, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "it is my great honor to welcome you to the annual Veterans Recognition Gala. Tonight we celebrate the brave men and women who have served our great nation with distinction and valor." Marcus resisted the urge to scoff. He had heard these speeches before, filled with grand words and empty promises. He had seen politicians like Harrington use veterans as props for photo ops, only to vote against bills that would provide them with the support they desperately needed. As Harrington continued his speech, Marcus felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Tanya standing there, elegant in a simple black dress, her eyes, so much like his own, filled with concern. "You okay, Dad?" she whispered, leaning close to be heard over the senator's booming voice. Marcus nodded, managing a small smile for his daughter's benefit. "Just fine, baby girl." Tanya's gaze lingered on him for a moment, clearly unconvinced. "You don't have to stay the whole time. Just mingle a bit, then we can head out." "I'll be fine," Marcus assured her. Go on back to your colleagues. I know you've got work to do." Tanya hesitated, then placed a quick kiss on his cheek before disappearing back into the crowd. Marcus watched her go, pride swelling in his chest. His daughter, with her master's degree and important job at a nonprofit, represented everything he had fought for. A future where she could walk through doors that had been closed to him. The senator's speech concluded to enthusiastic applause, and the event transitioned to the awards portion of the evening. Marcus listened as names were called, as men and women made their way to the stage to receive plaques and medals, their service records recited for the audience's admiration. "And now," the senator announced, "it is my privilege to present our highest honor of the evening, the Distinguished Service Award, to Commander William Shepard for his exemplary leadership during Operation Desert Storm." The crowd erupted in applause as a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s approached the stage. His uniform was impeccable, adorned with rows of medals that spoke to a lifetime of service. As he accepted the award, Commander Shepard delivered a humble speech about duty and honor, about the men who had served under him, about the sacrifices made by military families. Marcus listened, his expression neutral, though his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of men whose names would never be called at events like this, men who had died beside him in jungles and deserts, their bodies sometimes never recovered, their families told only that they had died in service to their country. As the formal presentations concluded, the attendees began to mingle once more. Marcus decided it was time to make his exit. He had fulfilled his promise to Tanya. He had come, he had mingled, he had endured. Now he could return to the solitude of his small apartment, where the walls didn't close in on him the way they did in crowded rooms like this. He was making his way toward the exit when a server rounded the corner too quickly, bumping into him. The tray of champagne flutes teetered precariously, and Marcus instinctively reached out to steady it, preventing what would have been a spectacular crash. "I'm so sorry, sir," the young server exclaimed, his face flushed with embarrassment. "No harm done," Marcus replied, helping to right the last wobbling glass. In the process, his sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing the crescent-shaped scar on his forearm. It was only visible for a moment before Marcus tugged his sleeve back into place, but that moment was enough. "You okay, Dad?" Tanya had appeared at his side again, having witnessed the near collision. "Just fine," Marcus assured her, his tone indicating he was ready to leave. Tanya nodded in understanding. "Let me just grab my coat and we can go." As Tanya walked away, Marcus felt a presence behind him. He turned to find a man standing there, watching him with an intensity that immediately put Marcus on edge. The man was in his 40s, with close-cropped hair and the bearing of someone who had spent significant time in the military. His eyes, however, were what caught Marcus's attention. They held a recognition that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low and controlled. "I couldn't help but notice the mark on your arm." Marcus stiffened, his expression carefully blank. "Just an old scar." The man stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "That's no ordinary scar. That's a SEAL Team 6 identifier mark, 1983 to 1987. The world seemed to freeze around Marcus. No one had recognized that mark in decades. No one was supposed to know what it meant. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Marcus said evenly, though his heart was pounding in his chest. The man's eyes never left Marcus's face. "No, I don't think I do. My name is Commander Ryan Mitchell, Navy SEALs, retired. And unless I'm mistaken, you're Marcus Washington. Call sign, Phantom." He paused, studying Marcus's reaction. "The thing is, according to official records, Phantom died during an operation in Nicaragua in 1986. Marcus felt the carefully constructed walls of his life begin to crack. The name, the call sign, the operation, all details that had been buried in classified files, details that no one outside a very small circle should know. "You've got the wrong man," Marcus insisted, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Mitchell shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think I do. You see, my father was Commander Jack Mitchell. He led SEAL Team 6 during that period." He paused, letting the information sink in. "He told me about Phantom before he died, about how the only black operator on an elite team saved his life and the lives of 5 other men during a mission gone wrong, about how that man was left behind, presumed dead, because the extraction was compromised." Marcus felt as though the floor beneath him had suddenly disappeared. Commander Jack Mitchell had been his commanding officer, a man he had respected above all others, a man who had looked him in the eye and promised they would come back for him, just before the helicopter had lifted off, leaving Marcus alone in hostile territory. "Your father," Marcus began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat. "My father never forgave himself for leaving you behind," Mitchell said softly. "He spent years trying to find out what happened to you, but all trails went cold. The official story was that you died in that jungle." Marcus glanced around the room, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. "This isn't the place to have this conversation." Mitchell nodded in understanding. "I know, but I've been looking for you for a long time, ever since I found my father's private files after his death." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, offering it to Marcus. "There are people who need to know the truth, Marcus. People who need to hear your story." Marcus stared at the card, making no move to take it. "Some stories are better left untold." "Not yours," Mitchell insisted. "What happened to you, what really happened, deserves to be acknowledged. The men you saved, the mission you completed alone, against all odds. That's not something that should remain buried." Before Marcus could respond, Tanya returned with her coat. She looked between the two men, sensing the tension. "Everything okay?" Marcus quickly composed himself. "Everything's fine. This is Commander Mitchell. We were just catching up." Mitchell extended his hand to Tanya, his smile genuine. "Your father is a remarkable man." Tanya shook his hand, her expression curious. "I've always thought so, though he doesn't like to talk about his time in the service." "Some experiences are difficult to put into words," Mitchell said, his gaze returning to Marcus. "But sometimes, sharing those experiences can help not just ourselves, but others who've walked similar paths." Marcus felt a knot forming in his throat. For decades he had carried his story alone, had buried it so deep that sometimes he could almost convince himself it had happened to someone else. The thought of bringing it all back to the surface, of exposing those old wounds to the light, terrified him in a way that nothing had since those harrowing days in the jungle. "We should get going," Marcus said to Tanya, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tanya nodded, sensing her father's discomfort. "It was nice meeting you, Commander." As they turned to leave, Mitchell held out the business card one more time. "Just think about it, Marcus. That's all I'm asking." After a moment's hesitation, Marcus took the card, slipping it into his pocket without looking at it. He could feel Mitchell's eyes on him as he and Tanya walked away, could feel the weight of unspoken histories and buried truths pressing down on him. Outside, the cool evening air filled his lungs, bringing a momentary sense of relief. The stars were visible above the city skyline, distant and unchanging. Marcus had often looked to those same stars during the long nights in captivity, finding solace in their constancy when everything else in his world had been shattered. "Who was that man, Dad?" Tanya asked as they waited for the valet to bring her car around. Marcus stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. "Just someone who thinks he knows something about me." Tanya studied her father's profile, the strong lines of his face illuminated by the streetlights. "And does he?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Marcus had never told Tanya the truth about his service, had never shared the nightmares that still woke him in the middle of the night, sweat-soaked and gasping for air. He had protected her from that darkness, had wanted her to see him only as her father, not as the man he had been forced to become in those distant jungles. But now, with Mitchell's appearance, the past he had so carefully buried was threatening to surface, and Marcus wasn't sure he had the strength to push it back down again. "Yes," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think he does." That night, sleep eluded Marcus. He sat on the edge of his bed in the darkness of his modest apartment, Commander Mitchell's business card between his fingers. The embossed lettering caught the moonlight filtering through the blinds. Commander Ryan Mitchell, Navy SEALs, Redderburg Veterans Truth Commission. Marcus hadn't heard of the Veterans Truth Commission before, but the name itself stirred something in him, an emotion he couldn't quite place. Hope? Fear? Perhaps both. He set the card on his nightstand and lowered himself onto his back, staring at the ceiling. The encounter with Mitchell had cracked open a door he'd kept firmly shut for decades, and now memories were seeping through like water through a damaged hull. Nicaragua, 1986. The mission had seemed straightforward on paper: infiltrate a rebel compound, extract a high-value intelligence asset, and disappear without a trace. SEAL Team 6 operations were never truly simple, but this one had carried the additional weight of political sensitivity. The Reagan administration couldn't afford to be caught operating in Nicaragua. If they were compromised, the official stance was clear: they didn't exist. Marcus closed his eyes, and suddenly he was there again, moving silently through the dense jungle, the weight of his weapon familiar in his hands, the humid air clinging to his skin. 6 men, moving as one, communicating with hand signals and knowing glances. Commander Jack Mitchell at the lead, Marcus bringing up the rear, the position he preferred, where he could watch over everyone. The memory shifted, fragments rearranging themselves. The sudden eruption of gunfire, the realization that they'd walked into an ambush, the frantic scramble for cover as bullets tore through foliage and flesh alike. 2 men down in the first volley. Mitchell shouting orders over the chaos, and Marcus calculating angles, distances, probabilities, the way he always did under pressure. "Clear the south approach," he remembered shouting to Mitchell as he sprinted toward the heaviest concentration of enemy fire, drawing attention away from his wounded teammates. What happened next had become a blur of violence and desperation in his memory, a brutal close-quarters battle that left him wounded but still moving, still fighting. By the time the extraction helicopter arrived, Marcus had cleared a path for the survivors, but in doing so, had positioned himself too far from the landing zone. He could still see Mitchell's face as the helicopter began to lift, the commander's eyes locked on his, a silent promise passing between them. "We'll come back for you." But they never did. A soft knock on his bedroom door pulled Marcus back to the present. "Dad?" Tanya's voice was gentle. "Are you awake?" Marcus sat up, switching on the bedside lamp. "Come in, baby girl." Tanya opened the door, already dressed for work in a tailored pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She held 2 mugs of coffee, offering one to Marcus as she sat beside him on the bed. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. She knew her father's patterns, knew the nights when the past kept him company. Marcus accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Just thinking." "About that man from last night? Commander Mitchell?" Marcus took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through him before answering. "Among other things." Tanya studied her father's face, the deep lines around his eyes, the gray that had overtaken his once black hair. At 63, Marcus Washington still carried himself with the discipline and strength of a much younger man, but in moments like this, the weight of his years, and what they contained, was visible. He knew something about your service, didn't he? She pressed gently. Something you've never talked about. Marcus had always been private about his military past. Tanya knew the basics, that he had served in the army during the Cold War, that he had been honorably discharged, that he sometimes woke in the night fighting enemies only he could see. But the details, the specifics of what he had done and seen, had remained locked away. There are some things a father doesn't share with his daughter, Marcus said, his voice low. Some burdens you shouldn't have to carry. Tanya placed her hand over his, her touch warm and steady. But maybe they're not just your burdens to carry anymore, Dad. Maybe it's time to set some of them down. Marcus looked at his daughter, this remarkable woman he had raised alone after her mother's death, this child who had grown into someone so strong and compassionate. He had always wanted to protect her from the darkness he had known, but now he wondered if his silence had built a wall between them instead. I don't know if I can, he admitted, the words catching in his throat. You don't have to do it alone. Tanya squeezed his hand. Whatever it is, whatever happened, I'm here. Marcus felt a surge of love for his daughter, mixed with a deep ache for all the truths he had never shared. Let me think about it, he said finally. There's a lot to consider. Tanya nodded, accepting this small concession. She glanced at her watch and sighed. I have to get to work. Will you be okay? I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Marcus said with a small smile. Go on, do good things. After Tanya left, Marcus showered and dressed, his movements mechanical, his mind elsewhere. He made himself breakfast, eggs and toast, the same meal he'd prepared most mornings since returning to civilian life. Routine had been his sanctuary, his way of imposing order on a world that had once spiraled beyond his control. As he ate, he found himself looking at Mitchell's card again, the Veterans Truth Commission. The name suggested purpose, a mission to uncover something hidden, but Marcus knew better than most that some truths once unearthed couldn't be buried again. His phone rang, startling him. He didn't recognize the number, but something compelled him to answer. Marcus Washington. His voice was guarded, neutral. Mr. Washington, this is Commander Mitchell. The voice on the other end was clear, direct. I hope I'm not calling too early. Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. How did you get this number? A pause. I have resources, Mr. Washington. Finding people is part of what I do now. And what exactly is it that you do? Marcus asked, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. I help veterans whose stories have been buried, classified, or distorted receive the recognition and support they deserve. Mitchell's tone was earnest, passionate. Men like you, who sacrificed everything for their country, only to be erased from the record. Marcus felt a flicker of anger. Maybe those records were classified for a reason. Or maybe they were classified to protect the wrong people, Mitchell countered. Look, I understand your reluctance, but I've spent years piecing together what happened in Nicaragua, and there are people, important people, who need to hear the truth from you. What people? Marcus demanded. The Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, for one. They're conducting hearings on classified Cold War operations and the treatment of operators who were... Mitchell hesitated, then continued. Left behind. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Left behind. Such a simple phrase for what had been the most devastating moment of his life. I'm not interested in becoming a political talking point, Marcus said, his voice hard. This isn't about politics, Mitchell insisted. This is about justice. For you and for others like you. Men who were told they didn't exist, whose sacrifices were erased because acknowledging them would have been politically inconvenient. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those decades pressing down on him. What exactly are you asking me to do? Meet with me. Hear what I have to say. After that, if you still want nothing to do with this, I'll respect your decision." Marcus was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. The safe choice, the choice he had made every day for 39 years, was to say no, to retreat back into the careful anonymity he had constructed. But something had shifted inside him since last night, since Mitchell had recognized the mark on his arm. "Fine," Marcus finally said. "One meeting." "Thank you," Mitchell replied, relief evident in his voice. "There's a coffee shop called Brewster's on Commonwealth Avenue. Can you meet me there at noon?" "I'll be there," Marcus said, then ended the call before he could change his mind. He spent the next few hours trying to distract himself with household chores, but his thoughts kept returning to Nicaragua, to the events that had altered the course of his life. It wasn't just the ambush, the fighting, or even being left behind that haunted him. It was what came after. The 18 months of captivity, interrogation, and torture at the hands of rebels who believed he was CIA. 18 months of being told that his country had abandoned him, that no one was coming for him. 18 months of refusing to break, of clinging to the belief that his sacrifice had meaning, that the men he had saved were worth the price he was paying. And then, the escape. 3 days of moving through hostile territory with a bullet wound in his side, navigating by stars and sheer determination, finding his way to a border crossing, collapsing into the arms of surprised officials who had no idea who he was or what to do with him. The debriefing that followed had been clinical, cold. The men in suits who questioned him seemed more concerned with what he might say than with what he had endured. They had offered him a choice: sign documents swearing him to secrecy about the operation and his captivity, or face charges of violating operational security. A broken man with no support system, no family waiting for him, Marcus had signed. They gave him a new identity, a disability pension under a different name, and a firm warning about the consequences of breaking his silence. He had rebuilt his life from there, piece by painful piece. As the clock approached noon, Marcus put on his jacket and headed for the door. He paused by the small table in the hallway where he kept his wallet and keys. Beside them was a worn photograph in a simple frame. Marcus in his army dress uniform, standing proud and tall before Nicaragua before everything changed. He picked up the photo, studying the face of the young man he had been, confident, idealistic, believing in the mission and the men beside him. That man had died in the jungles of Nicaragua. The question now was whether what remained of him had the strength to revisit that death. Marcus set the photo down, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. Whatever Mitchell wanted, whatever truths he thought needed telling, Marcus would listen. After that, he would decide whether some ghosts were better left at rest, or if, after all these years, it was finally time to let them speak. The walk to Brewster's took him through familiar streets, past the faces of strangers who had no idea who walked among them. For decades, that anonymity had been his shield. Now, with each step toward the coffee shop, toward Mitchell, Marcus felt that shield beginning to crack. He spotted Mitchell immediately upon entering Brewster's. The commander sat at a corner table, his posture military straight despite the casual setting, his eyes alert and watchful. He raised a hand in greeting as Marcus approached, standing to offer a firm handshake. "Mr. Washington," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the respect of one soldier for another. "Thank you for coming." Marcus nodded, taking the seat across from him. "Let's hear what you have to say, Commander, and then I'll decide if your truth is worth the cost of telling it." The coffee shop hummed with the quiet energy of the lunch crowd. Students hunched over laptops, business people on their breaks, baristas calling out orders. It was a normal day for everyone except Marcus Washington, who sat across from a man who had unearthed the secret he'd buried for nearly 4 decades. Mitchell slid a manila folder across the table. I want to show you something before we talk. Marcus eyed the folder warily, but made no move to open it. What is this? My father's personal records, Mitchell said. After he died 5 years ago, I found a locked box in his study. Inside were unofficial accounts of missions that never officially happened, including the one in Nicaragua. Marcus's jaw tightened. Your father should have destroyed those. Maybe, Mitchell conceded, but I'm glad he didn't. He tapped the folder with his index finger. He kept track of everyone, Marcus, every operator he ever commanded, their successes, their failures, their sacrifices. But you were different. How so? Marcus asked, still not touching the folder. Mitchell leaned forward, lowering his voice. He never stopped looking for you. Even after the official search was called off, even after he was ordered to list you as KIA, he kept searching. He had contacts, independent contractors, retired intelligence officers, missionaries working in Central America, all keeping an eye out for any sign of you. Marcus felt a tightness in his chest. The thought of Commander Jack Mitchell still searching for him, still remembering, cut through decades of bitterness. Then why didn't he find me? Marcus asked, the question more vulnerable than he'd intended. Mitchell's expression softened. He did. 1988. He traced you to a hospital in Costa Rica, but by the time his contact got there, you were gone. Disappeared into thin air. Marcus remembered that hospital, the concerned doctors, the embassy official who had arranged his quiet transport back to the United States, the debriefings that followed, the agreements he had signed. The agency got to me first, Marcus said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Mitchell nodded. That's what my father suspected. He tried to locate you through official channels after that, but it was like you'd been erased. New identity, new life. All traces of Marcus Washington, SEAL Team 6 operator, gone. Marcus finally reached for the folder, opening it to find meticulously kept notes, newspaper clippings, and photographs. At the top was a black and white photo of SEAL Team 6, taken just before the Nicaragua mission. 6 men in combat gear, faces serious, eyes determined. Marcus stood at the end, the only black face among them. Your father ran a tight team, Marcus said, his fingertips lightly touching the photograph. Best commander I ever served under. He said the same about you, Mitchell replied. Best operator he ever commanded. That's why what happened in Nicaragua haunted him until the day he died. Marcus looked up sharply. What exactly did he tell you about Nicaragua? Mitchell met his gaze steadily. That your team was sent to extract a high-value intelligence asset from a rebel compound. That the intel was bad. The compound was more heavily guarded than expected. That you were ambushed, and when the extraction chopper had to leave early due to approaching hostile forces, you stayed behind to hold off the enemy so the rest of the team could make it out. It was a simplified version of events, but accurate enough. Marcus nodded slightly, encouraging Mitchell to continue. He told me they were ordered not to go back for you, Mitchell said, his voice tinged with old anger. That by the time he convinced his superiors to authorize a rescue mission, the rebel camp had been abandoned and there was no sign of you. You were declared KIA, and the mission was classified so deeply that most people at the Pentagon didn't even know it had happened. Marcus closed the folder, pushing it back toward Mitchell. That's all ancient history now. Is it? Mitchell challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like unfinished business. He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. Do you know what my father's biggest regret was? Not disobeying orders. Not going back for you immediately, regardless of the consequences. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Marcus had often wondered about that in the dark days of his captivity, whether his team would return for him, whether they even could. Learning now that Jack Mitchell had wanted to come back, had been prevented from doing so, stirred emotions Marcus had long suppressed. "What happened to you after they left?" Mitchell asked quietly. Marcus's expression hardened. "That's not something I discuss." "I understand," Mitchell said, though his disappointment was evident. "But that's part of why I'm here, Marcus. Those 18 months you were missing, they're a black hole in the record. What you endured, what you learned, what you did to survive, it's information that could help others, could change how we prepare operators for worst-case scenarios. And you think dragging all that up now, nearly 40 years later, serves some greater good?" Marcus asked, skepticism clear in his voice. Mitchell pulled out another document from his briefcase, sliding it across the table. "This is why. Senate Resolution 342, establishing a special committee to investigate classified Cold War operations and the treatment of personnel involved in those operations, particularly those who were captured, killed, or left behind." Marcus skimmed the document, his heart rate accelerating as he read. This wasn't just about his story. It was about dozens, maybe hundreds of operations that had been buried, men and women whose sacrifices had been hidden behind walls of classification and national security. "Senator James Lawrence is heading the committee," Mitchell continued. "He's a good man, a former Marine. He believes that acknowledging these operations, recognizing the operators who carried them out, is long overdue." "Recognition," Marcus repeated, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "What good is recognition 40 years after the fact?" "It's not just about recognition," Mitchell countered. "It's about setting the record straight. It's about making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to the next generation of operators. And yes, it's about benefits, compensation, and support for those who were denied them because their missions officially never happened." Marcus fell silent, considering the implications. For decades, he had lived with the knowledge that his service, his sacrifice, would never be acknowledged. He had made peace with that, or so he had thought. But now, sitting across from Jack Mitchell's son, being offered a chance to tell his story, to be heard, he felt something stir within him, a long, dormant sense of justice. "There's something else you should know," Mitchell said, his tone shifting. "You're not the only one. There are others, men and women from other classified operations who have come forward, some from your era, some from more recent conflicts. But your case could be the one that breaks this thing wide open." "Because of Nicaragua?" Marcus asked. Mitchell shook his head. "Because of what came after. The 18 months you were missing, your escape, and the way the government handled your return. There are rumors, Marcus, rumors that you weren't just abandoned once, but twice. That when you made it back, instead of being celebrated, you were silenced." Marcus's expression remained neutral, but inwardly, he felt a jolt of surprise. Mitchell knew more than he had let on initially. The question was how much more, and from what sources. "Rumors are just that," Marcus said carefully. "Rumors." "Then help me separate fact from fiction," Mitchell pressed. "Tell me what really happened. Not for publication, not for the record. Just me, trying to understand my father's unfinished business." Marcus studied the younger man's face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. What he saw instead was earnestness, determination, and something that reminded him painfully of Jack Mitchell, an unwavering commitment to his men, even long after the mission was over. "What you're asking," Marcus began, then paused, gathering his thoughts. "It's not just about breaking silence. It's about reopening wounds that took a lifetime to close." "I know," Mitchell acknowledged. "And I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe it was important. Not just for the historical record, not just for my father's peace, but for you, Marcus." "For me?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Some burdens are heavier when carried alone. Mitchell said simply. My father taught me that. The words echoed Tanya's from that morning, and Marcus felt a strange sense of convergence, as if forces beyond his control were pushing him toward confronting his past. He took a deep breath, then asked the question that had been on his mind since their first encounter. If I were to do this, and I'm not saying I will, what exactly would it involve? Relief flickered across Mitchell's face. Initially, just conversations, you and me, documenting your experiences. Then, if you're willing, testimony before the Senate committee. It would be a closed session, classified at the highest level. And the men responsible for leaving me behind, for silencing me when I returned, what happens to them? Mitchell hesitated. Some are still in positions of power. Others have retired. The committee's primary goal isn't punishment. It's truth and reconciliation. But if laws were broken, if there was genuine malfeasance, those issues would be referred to the proper authorities. Marcus nodded slowly, processing this information. I need time to think about this, to discuss it with my daughter. Of course, Mitchell said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small digital recorder. But before you go, there's something I think you should hear. He placed the recorder on the table and pressed play. A gravelly voice, weakened by age but still commanding, filled the small space between them. This is Commander Jack Mitchell, United States Navy, retired. Date is June 17, 2020. If you're listening to this, Ryan, it means I didn't live long enough to finish what I started. Find Marcus Washington. He's out there somewhere, living under a different name, probably. Tell him I never stopped looking. Tell him I'm sorry, and tell him his country owes him a debt that's long overdue. The operation in Nicaragua wasn't what we were told. There were layers to it that none of us understood at the time. I've spent decades piecing it together, and what I've found, it changes everything. Marcus wasn't just a SEAL doing his job. He was a convenient sacrifice in a game much bigger than any of us knew. The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Marcus stared at the small device, his mind racing with implications. What did he mean? Marcus asked finally. What game? Mitchell's expression was grim. That's what I've been trying to figure out for the past 5 years. My father left notes, theories, but nothing concrete. He believed the Nicaragua operation was cover for something else, something so sensitive that abandoning an elite operator was considered an acceptable loss. Marcus's hands clenched into fists under the table. All these years he had believed his abandonment was a tactical decision, a hard choice made in the heat of combat. The idea that it might have been planned, that he might have been deliberately sacrificed, sent a surge of cold anger through him. I need those notes, Marcus said, his voice low and intent. All of them. Mitchell nodded, relief evident in his expression. Does that mean you're in? Marcus stood, his decision made. It means I want the truth, Commander, the whole truth. After 40 years of silence, I think I've earned that much. As he walked out of the coffee shop, Marcus felt a strange lightness, as if the first link in a chain that had bound him for decades had finally broken. Whatever came next, the reopening of old wounds, the confrontation with powerful men who had buried his story, he would face it. Not just for himself, but for all the others who had been left behind, forgotten, erased. The game Jack Mitchell had mentioned in his final recording, Marcus intended to uncover it, to understand it, and perhaps finally, to end it. The crescent-shaped scar on his arm seemed to tingle, a physical reminder of the oath he had taken so long ago, to defend his country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Some oaths, it seemed, didn't expire with discharge papers or classification orders. Some oaths were written in the blood and bone of the men who took them. And Marcus Washington had never been one to break his word. The drive to Mitchell's suburban home the following weekend felt like crossing a threshold. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of Tanya's car, a thick folder of his own on his lap, documents he had kept hidden for decades in a lockbox at the back of his closet, discharge papers under a different name, medical records with critical information redacted, photos he wasn't supposed to have. "You sure about this, Dad?" Tanya asked, glancing away from the road briefly to study her father's face. After he had told her everything, or at least as much as he felt she needed to know, she had insisted on accompanying him to this meeting. "No," Marcus admitted, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the folder. "But I'm doing it anyway." Tanya reached over and squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens, I'm with you." The house was modest, a colonial with a well-maintained yard and an American flag flying from the porch. Mitchell greeted them at the door, shaking Marcus's hand firmly before extending the same courtesy to Tanya. "Thank you for coming," he said, ushering them inside, "and for bringing your daughter." The living room had been transformed into an impromptu conference room. A large table dominated the space, covered with stacks of folders, photographs, and maps. A digital recorder sat at the center, alongside a laptop and a scanner. On the wall, Mitchell had created what could only be described as an investigation board, photos connected by red string, timeline markers, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. "You've been busy," Marcus observed, taking it all in. Mitchell nodded. "My father left behind quite the puzzle. I've been trying to piece it together for years." He guided them to the table where 3 chairs had been arranged. As they sat, Mitchell gestured to the digital recorder. "If it's all right with you, I'd like to record our conversations. Everything stays confidential until you decide otherwise." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Let's get started." Mitchell pressed the record button, then stated the date and the names of those present. "Let's begin with what you know about the mission objectives in Nicaragua, 1986. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering his thoughts, or perhaps his courage. When he opened them, his gaze was focused and clear. "The official briefing described it as an extraction operation," he began, his voice steady. "High-value intelligence asset, codenamed Condor, had contacted our embassy in Honduras claiming to have critical information about Soviet arms shipments to rebel forces. Our job was to infiltrate a compound approximately 20 miles north of Managua, extract Condor, and bring him to a designated pickup point." Mitchell made a note on his pad. 6-man team, correct?" "Correct. Your father commanding, me as second in command. 4 other operators, Schultz, Rivera, Thompson, and Miller." "And the mission went south how?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "The intel was wrong. The compound wasn't just a rebel outpost. It was a major operational hub. At least 30 heavily armed fighters, not the 8 to 10 we'd been told to expect, and Condor." He paused. "Condor wasn't there. At least not in the location we'd been given." "So it was a setup," Tanya interjected, her eyes wide. Mitchell looked at her, then back to Marcus. "Is that what you believe? That your team was deliberately sent into a trap?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "At the time, I thought it was just bad intelligence. Common enough in our line of work. But now, with what your father said in that recording..." He trailed off, considering the implications. "What happened when you realized the intel was bad?" Mitchell prompted. "We tried to abort, to retreat without engaging. But we were spotted. The firefight was intense." Marcus's voice remained controlled, but his eyes had taken on a distant look. "Schultz took a round to the shoulder early on. Miller was hit in the leg. We were pinned down, outgunned with no clear escape route." Mitchell nodded, his expression solemn. "And that's when you made the call to stay behind." "It wasn't a call," Marcus corrected. It was the only option. The extraction helicopter was 5 minutes out, but we had hostiles advancing from all sides. Someone had to create a diversion to draw enough fire so the others could reach the LZ. He paused. Your father didn't want to leave me. I had to convince him it was the only way to save the team. The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled around them. Tanya reached for her father's hand again, her fingers intertwining with his. What happened after the helicopter left? Mitchell asked softly. Marcus took a deep breath. This was the part he had never shared with anyone, not even the CIA debriefers who had questioned him after his escape. I held position as long as I could, he said. Used up almost all my ammunition keeping them at bay. When I tried to fall back to secondary position, I took a hit. He gestured to his right side. Not fatal, but it slowed me down. They surrounded me within minutes. Mitchell leaned forward. The rebels? Marcus nodded. They didn't kill me on the spot, which was my first indication that something was off. Typical rebel protocol would have been to execute an enemy combatant immediately, especially an American. Instead, they took me prisoner. Do you know why? Mitchell asked. Not at first, Marcus replied. But it became clear during the interrogations. They thought I was CIA, part of some operation they called Midnight Sun. They kept asking about codes, drop points, contacts, none of which meant anything to me. Mitchell's expression shifted, a flash of recognition crossing his face. Midnight Sun, he repeated. That name appears in my father's notes, but with no context. Marcus frowned. Whatever it was, the rebels believed it was significant enough to keep me alive for information. Their interrogation methods were thorough. The clinical word did little to mask the reality, and Tanya visibly flinched. Marcus squeezed her hand reassuringly before continuing. For the first 3 months, they kept me in a cell beneath the compound. Daily interrogations, minimal food and water, no medical treatment for my wound, standard tactics to break resistance. When that didn't work, they transferred me to another facility somewhere deeper in the jungle. Did you ever learn who was in charge? Mitchell asked. Names, ranks, affiliations? Marcus nodded slowly. The man who led most of the interrogations called himself Colonel Vasquez, but he wasn't Nicaraguan. His Spanish had a different accent, Cuban maybe. And there were others, observers, who never spoke. One in particular, an American, I'm sure of it. Mitchell's head snapped up. An American? Working with the rebels? Not with them, Marcus clarified. Above them, somehow. He would come in after the interrogations, review notes, whisper instructions to Vasquez. Never spoke directly to me, never let me see his face clearly. But I heard him once giving orders to the guards. No accent, educated American English. Mitchell quickly scribbled notes. Can you describe him at all? Marcus closed his eyes, reaching back through decades to retrieve the memory. Tall, lean build, gray at the temples. He wore expensive shoes. Always noticed that because it stood out in the jungle setting. Italian leather, polished even in those conditions. And a ring, distinctive. Gold with a red stone, worn on his right hand. A class ring, maybe, Mitchell suggested. Possibly, Marcus agreed. Whatever his role, he had authority. When he gave orders, even Vasquez complied without question. Mitchell made another note, then asked, How did you escape? A faint smile crossed Marcus's face, the first since they'd begun. They got careless. After more than a year with no results from their interrogations, they started to see me as less valuable. Guards were reduced, security protocols relaxed. I spent months cataloging their routines, identifying weaknesses in their perimeter. And then, Mitchell prompted. Heavy rainfall caused flooding in part of the facility. In the confusion of evacuating equipment, I managed to overpower a guard, take his weapon, made it to the perimeter before the alarm was raised. Marcus's voice remained steady, matter-of-fact, as if recounting a training exercise rather than a desperate fight for survival. Spent 3 days evading pursuit, moving only at night, using stars for navigation. Crossed into Costa Rica on the 3rd day, collapsed near a village. Local priest found me, got me to a hospital. And that's when the U.S. officials found you, Mitchell concluded. Marcus nodded. 2 days in the hospital before they showed up. Man in a suit, no identification, but clearly government. Said he was there to bring me home. I was in no condition to ask questions. What happened when you got back to the States? Tanya asked, speaking up for the first time in a while. Marcus turned to his daughter, his expression softening slightly. Not what I expected. No hero's welcome, no debriefing with my unit. Instead, I was taken to a facility in Virginia, unmarked building, no military presence. 3 men in suits conducted the debriefing, if you can call it that. Felt more like an interrogation than a mission report. Did they ask about Midnight Sun? Mitchell inquired. No, Marcus replied, his brow furrowing. That's what was strange. They showed no interest in anything related to the rebels' questions or this Midnight Sun operation. They focused entirely on what I had told my captors, whether I had revealed any operational details about SEAL Team 6. They were more concerned about what you might have disclosed than what you had endured, Mitchell said, his tone grim. Exactly. After 3 days of debriefing, they presented me with papers to sign, non-disclosure agreements, classified operation protocols, a statement acknowledging that my mission in Nicaragua had never happened and that discussing it would constitute a federal offense. And they offered you a new identity, Mitchell added. Marcus nodded, reaching for the folder he had brought. He opened it, removing a set of documents and sliding them across the table. Michael Williams, honorable discharge from the Army, not the Navy, with a service record that never mentioned SEAL Team 6 or any special operations. Disability pension for injuries sustained in a training accident, not combat. New Social Security number, new military ID, new life. Mitchell examined the documents, his expression darkening. They erased you, he said quietly. Not just me, Marcus replied. The entire operation. When I asked about the rest of the team, about your father, they told me all records had been sealed at the highest level. I wasn't permitted contact with any former teammates. It was made very clear that any attempt to reach out would result in termination of benefits and possible prosecution. So you just accepted it? Tanya asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Marcus turned to her, his eyes filled with a sadness she had rarely seen. I was broken, baby girl, physically, mentally. I had no family waiting for me, no support system. The life I had known was gone. They offered a path forward, a way to survive. So yes, I took it. The room fell silent as the magnitude of what Marcus had endured, not just in captivity but in the isolation that followed, sank in. Mitchell finally broke the silence. There's something I haven't told you yet, he said, rising from his chair and moving to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He retrieved a thick folder, its edges worn with age. After my father died, I didn't just find his notes. I found these. He placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing dozens of letters, all unopened, all addressed to Marcus Washington at various military and veterans offices, all returned with no such person or address unknown stamps. He wrote to you, Mitchell said softly. For years after Nicaragua, he tried to find you through official channels, through unofficial ones. These are the letters that came back. Marcus stared at the envelopes, his hand hovering over them, not quite touching. He really did look for me, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Until the day he died, Mitchell confirmed. His last journal entry, dated 2 days before his heart attack, was about you. Still searching for Phantom, it said. The truth won't stay buried forever. Marcus finally picked up one of the letters, turning it over in his hands as if it were a precious artifact. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the sealed envelope. Mitchell nodded. "They're yours." With careful movements, Marcus opened the letter, unfolding the pages inside. The handwriting was neat, disciplined, just as he remembered Jack Mitchell to be. As he read, the decades seemed to fall away, and he was once again the young SEAL operator, receiving guidance from the commander he had respected above all others. The letter was dated November 1986, just 2 months after the Nicaragua operation. It was brief, direct, quintessential Jack Mitchell. "Phantom, if by some miracle this reaches you, know that we are still looking. The official search has been called off, but I haven't given up. Something about this mission stinks, and I'm digging into it. Stay alive. That's an order. J.M." Marcus folded the letter carefully, his face revealing nothing of the storm of emotions behind his composed exterior. "I need to read the rest," he said quietly. "All of them." Mitchell nodded. "Of course." Tanya, watching her father with concern, asked, "What happens next?" Mitchell glanced at Marcus, then back to Tanya. "That depends on your father. The Senate committee hearings begin in 3 weeks. If he's willing to testify, to tell his story, it could be the key to unlocking whatever this Midnight Sun operation was, and why it was worth abandoning an elite operator to protect its secrecy." Marcus looked up from the stack of letters, his decision already made. "I'll testify," he said firmly. "But first I need to understand exactly what I'm walking into. These men, whoever orchestrated this cover-up, they've had 40 years to bury their tracks. They won't take kindly to someone digging them up." "We'll be careful," Mitchell assured him. "Discreet." "No," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "We'll be thorough. These people took my life from me, Commander. I want to know who they are, what they were hiding, and why I was considered an acceptable loss." The determination in his voice was unmistakable, the voice of a warrior who had found his mission again after decades of forced retirement. "Then we'd better get to work," Mitchell said, reaching for his laptop. "Because if my father was right, this goes deeper than just one botched operation in Nicaragua. And the men responsible are still out there, still powerful." Marcus nodded, his gaze returning to the investigation board on the wall, to the red strings connecting people and events across decades. "Yes," he said quietly, "they are. But they don't know what's coming for them." For the first time in nearly 40 years, Marcus Washington felt the familiar surge of pre-mission focus, the clarity, the purpose, the absolute commitment to seeing a mission through, no matter the cost. Only this time, the mission was personal, and failure was not an option. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Marcus, Mitchell, and Tanya established a routine, meetings at Mitchell's house, poring over documents, cross-referencing dates and names, building a comprehensive timeline of events surrounding the Nicaragua operation. Marcus read through all of Jack Mitchell's letters, each one a painful reminder of what might have been had they reached him years ago. But it was a photograph in Mitchell's collection that provided their first real breakthrough, a group shot taken at a diplomatic function in Honduras, 1986, just weeks before the Nicaragua mission. In the background, partially obscured but unmistakable to Marcus, was the American who had observed his interrogations. "That's him," Marcus said, tapping the figure in the photo. "The American who was with Vasquez." Mitchell squinted at the image. "Are you sure? We can barely see his face." "It's the ring," Marcus explained, pointing to the man's right hand. "Gold with a red stone, just like I remembered." Mitchell scanned the photo's caption. U.S. delegation meeting with Honduran officials, March 1986. The names listed included diplomats, military attachés, and CIA operatives, but the man Marcus had identified wasn't named. "We need to identify him," Mitchell said, reaching for his laptop. "I have contacts who might be able to help. Facial recognition software, access to archives from that period." While Mitchell worked his connections, Marcus and Tanya focused on Midnight Sun, the operation the rebels had been so convinced he was part of. Jack Mitchell's notes mentioned it only in passing with no context or explanation, but Marcus had a hunch. "Your father's notes," he said to Mitchell one evening as they worked late into the night. "Did he ever mention any operations in Nicaragua prior to the one I was involved in?" Mitchell rifled through a stack of papers, extracting a thin file. "Just this, a reference to something called Operation Timberwolf, 1984. It was a joint CIA naval intelligence mission, but the details are sparse." Marcus took the file, skimming its contents. Timberwolf, that sounds familiar. He closed his eyes, reaching back through decades of memory. "One of my interrogators mentioned it once, asking if it was connected to Midnight Sun. Could be a predecessor operation," Mitchell suggested, "or a cover for the same thing." Tanya, who had been quietly researching on her laptop, looked up. "I might have something," she said, turning the screen toward them. "I've been cross-referencing declassified documents from that period with news reports about unusual activity in Central America. There's a pattern, a series of unexplained incidents along the Nicaragua-Honduras border between 1984 and 1986. Local reports of American presence where there shouldn't have been any, unusual shipments moving across borders, rebel groups suddenly flush with cash and weapons. Sounds like typical CIA activities during that period," Mitchell remarked. "Except," Tanya continued, "none of it appears in the official records of U.S. operations in the region. At least, not in the declassified ones." Marcus leaned forward, studying the timeline Tanya had constructed. "So we have evidence of American covert operations that don't align with any acknowledged CIA or military activities. That could be Midnight Sun. Or Timberwolf," Mitchell added. "Either way, it's off books. And worth abandoning a SEAL Team 6 operator to keep secret," Marcus said grimly. Their investigation took a concerning turn 3 days later when Mitchell arrived at their meeting looking troubled. "We may have a problem," he said, closing the door behind him and checking the windows before speaking further. "My contact at the DoD called. Someone's been asking questions about my research, specifically about my interest in Nicaragua operations from the 80s. Could be routine security protocols," Tanya suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. Mitchell shook his head. "The inquiry came from outside normal channels. My contact couldn't trace it back to any specific department or individual." Marcus's expression hardened. "They know we're digging." "But how?" Tanya asked. "We've been careful." "The Senate committee," Marcus suggested. "Your request for me to testify would have triggered notifications up the chain. If the right people saw it, people who know what we're looking for, they'd start watching us," Mitchell finished. "Which means we're on the right track." Despite the warning signs, they pressed on. Mitchell's contact in facial recognition came through, identifying the man in the Honduras photograph as Richard Keller, listed as a State Department advisor at the time. Further research revealed a career that spanned the CIA, State Department, and private defense contracting, with multiple postings throughout Central America during the 1980s. "This is him," Marcus said with certainty as they reviewed Keller's file, "the man who supervised my interrogations." But why would a State Department official be working with Nicaraguan rebels? Tanya wondered. State Department was likely just his cover, Mitchell explained. His real role could have been CIA or something even more compartmentalized. Whatever he was, Marcus said. "He's our link to Midnight Sun. We need to find him." That proved easier said than done. Richard Keller had retired from government service in 2004, according to official records, but his trail after that went cold. No current address, no social media presence, no recent photographs. A ghost in the digital age, which itself raised red flags. While Mitchell worked his connections trying to locate Keller, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. The number was blocked, the voice on the other end unfamiliar and cautious. "Is this Marcus Washington?" the caller asked. Marcus tensed. No one had called him by that name in decades. "Who's asking?" "Someone who served with you," the voice replied. "Someone who thought you were dead until a week ago." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "Identify yourself." "Carlos Rivera. We shared a helicopter ride out of Nicaragua in '86. Well, most of us did." Rivera. One of the 4 men Marcus had stayed behind to save. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in nearly 40 years. "How did you find me?" Marcus asked, his voice guarded. "Mitchell's son reached out to me, said you were alive, that you were going to testify." Rivera paused. "Is it true?" "Yes," Marcus confirmed after a moment's hesitation. "Then we need to talk, not over the phone, in person." Rivera gave an address, a diner in Alexandria, Virginia. "Tomorrow, 0700, come alone." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He debated whether to tell Mitchell about the call, eventually deciding that transparency was crucial at this stage. Mitchell's reaction was predictable. It could be a trap, he warned. Rivera could have been compromised, or it might not be Rivera at all. "I know," Marcus acknowledged, "but if it is him, he could have information we need." "Then I'm coming with you," Mitchell insisted. "He said to come alone. And I say that's not happening. We do this together or not at all." In the end, they compromised. Mitchell would accompany Marcus but remain outside the diner, watching for any signs of trouble. Tanya would stay behind, continuing their research from a secure location. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the weather matching the tension Marcus felt as Mitchell drove them to Alexandria. They arrived early, circling the block twice to check for surveillance or anything suspicious. The diner was a nondescript establishment, half full with the early morning crowd of commuters and locals. "I'll be right outside," Mitchell assured him as Marcus prepared to enter. "First sign of trouble, I'm coming in." Marcus nodded, straightening his jacket before walking in. He spotted Rivera immediately, older, heavier, his once black hair now silver, but unmistakable. He sat in a booth at the back, facing the door, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. Their eyes met, and Rivera's widened in recognition. He stood slowly as Marcus approached, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief, joy, and something deeper. Guilt, perhaps. "My God," Rivera whispered as Marcus reached the table. "It really is you." Marcus extended his hand. "Hello, Carlos." Rivera ignored the hand, pulling Marcus into a tight embrace instead. "We thought you were dead," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years." Marcus returned the embrace awkwardly, then eased himself into the booth across from Rivera. "A lot of people thought that." A waitress approached and Marcus ordered coffee, waiting until she had moved away before speaking again. "Mitchell said he contacted you." Rivera nodded. "Out of the blue, after all these years. Said you were alive, that you'd been back in the States since '88, that you were going to testify about Nicaragua." "That's right." Rivera leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you have any idea what you're stirring up? The people involved in that operation, they're still out there, Marcus, still powerful." "I'm counting on it," Marcus replied, his expression hardening. "I want to know why I was left behind, Carlos, why no one came back for me. and what Operation Midnight Sun was. Rivera's face paled at the mention of the name. "Where did you hear that?" he demanded. "My captors. They were convinced I was part of it, kept interrogating me about codes, drop points, contacts, none of which I knew anything about." Marcus studied Rivera's reaction carefully. "But you do, don't you?" Rivera's eyes darted around the diner nervously before returning to Marcus. "I don't know details. None of us did. But after we got back, after they told us you were KIA, things happened. Strange things." "What kind of things?" "Debriefings that felt more like interrogations. Questions about what we'd seen in Nicaragua besides the compound. Monitoring of our communications, our movements." Rivera's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. "Thompson was the first to ask questions about why we left you, why no rescue mission was mounted. 2 weeks later, he died in a car accident." Marcus felt a chill at Rivera's words. "And the others? Schultz and Miller?" "Schultz took a medical discharge, moved to Alaska. Last I heard, he was still there, living off the grid." "Miller?" Rivera hesitated. "Miller killed himself in '89. At least that's what they said." The implications were clear, and Marcus felt a surge of anger. "And you? What happened to you after Nicaragua?" "I kept my head down, did as I was told, finished my service, took a civilian job, tried to forget." Rivera's expression was haunted. "But you never really forget something like that, do you? Leaving a man behind." "You didn't leave me," Marcus said firmly. "You followed orders. Mitchell made the call he had to make to save the rest of the team." "But we should have come back for you," Rivera insisted, guilt evident in his voice. "We should have demanded a rescue mission. Instead, we just accepted it when they told us you were dead." Marcus could see the decades of regret etched into Rivera's face. "What else do you know about Midnight Sun?" he asked, steering the conversation back to their purpose. Rivera glanced around once more before responding. "Not much, just whispers, rumors. But I did hear one name connected to it years later, Richard Keller." Marcus straightened at the mention of the name. "What about him?" "He was CIA, not State Department like his cover suggested. Deep operations, the kind that don't make it into official records. After Nicaragua, he was promoted, moved up the ladder quickly." Rivera's voice dropped even lower. "There's something else you should know. Keller is still active." "Active?" "He'd be in his 70s by now." "Not field work," Rivera clarified. "Advisory role, special consultant to the National Security Council. He has the ear of some very powerful people, Marcus. People who won't want what happened in Nicaragua to come to light." The implications were clear. If Keller was still connected to government power structures, their investigation had just become infinitely more dangerous and more significant. "Is there anything else you can tell me?" Marcus pressed. "Anything that might help us understand what Midnight Sun was?" Rivera hesitated, then reached into his jacket, extracting a small, worn leather notebook. "I kept this, against regulations. My personal notes from the mission prep. There's nothing explicit about Midnight Sun, but there are details that never made it into the official briefing. Maybe they'll help." Marcus took the notebook, tucking it securely into his own jacket. "Thank you, Carlos." "Be careful, Marcus," Rivera warned, his expression grave. "These people, they've buried the truth for 40 years. They won't hesitate to bury anyone who tries to dig it up." "I've been buried once already," Marcus replied, his voice steely. "It didn't take." As they prepared to leave, Rivera gripped Marcus's arm suddenly. "There's one more thing," he said urgently. "Something Commander Mitchell told me before he died. He said the Nicaragua operation wasn't just about extracting an asset. He believed there was something at that compound, something valuable enough that certain people were willing to sacrifice everything to keep it secret." "Did he say what it was?" Rivera shook his head. "No. But whatever it was, it scared him. And Jack Mitchell wasn't scared of much. With those ominous words lingering between them, they parted ways, Rivera slipping out the back exit while Marcus rejoined Mitchell at the car. "Well?" Mitchell asked as Marcus slid into the passenger seat. Marcus handed him Rivera's notebook. "We've got a lot to talk about, and we need to move fast. The Senate hearings are in 9 days, and I think we just painted targets on our backs." Mitchell nodded grimly, starting the engine. "Then let's make sure we have something worth dying for." As they pulled away from the diner, neither man noticed the black sedan parked across the street, or the driver speaking quietly into a phone, his gold ring with a red stone catching the morning light as he gestured. "Confirmed," Richard Keller said into the phone. "Washington is alive and he remembers everything. We have a problem." Rivera's notebook proved more valuable than they had dared hope. Though the entries were cryptic, often just coordinates, initials, and terse observations, they painted a picture of an operation far more complex than a simple asset extraction. "Look at this," Mitchell said, pointing to an entry dated 3 days before the Nicaragua mission. "Coordinates for a location nearly 5 miles from the compound we were sent to infiltrate." Marcus leaned closer. "What's the notation beside it?" "Secondary objective. Command eyes only," Mitchell read. "And this symbol here, I've seen it in my father's notes. It was his personal shorthand for highly classified." "So there was a secondary objective," Marcus mused. "One that only your father knew about." "But why wouldn't he have briefed the team?" Tanya asked, looking up from her laptop where she was cross-referencing the coordinates. "Compartmentalization," Marcus explained. "Standard procedure for certain types of intelligence operations. Team members are only given the information necessary for their specific role, reduces risk if someone is captured." "Like you were," Mitchell said quietly. Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "But it doesn't explain why they didn't come back for me. Unless—" He trailed off, his brow furrowing. "Unless what?" Tanya prompted. "Unless retrieving me would have risked exposing whatever this secondary objective was." Marcus's voice hardened. "The question is, what was so important that they'd write off a SEAL Team 6 operator to keep it secret?" The coordinates in Rivera's notebook led them to satellite imagery of a remote area in the Nicaraguan jungle. Current images showed nothing but dense vegetation, but Mitchell had contacts who could access historical satellite data. By evening, they were looking at images from 1986, and what they revealed sent a chill through the room. "That's not a rebel compound," Tanya said, studying the grainy black and white image. "It looks more like a research facility," Marcus finished for her. "Look at the layout. Laboratory structures, living quarters, security perimeter. This wasn't some guerrilla camp. This was a sophisticated installation." Mitchell zoomed in on one section of the compound. "And these buildings here, they match Soviet designs from that era. This could have been a joint operation between the Nicaraguan rebels and Soviet advisors." But what were they researching? Tanya wondered. The answer came from an unexpected source. While Mitchell continued analyzing the satellite imagery, Tanya had been methodically searching through declassified CIA documents from the period. One heavily redacted report caught her attention. A brief mention of Soviet activities in Nicaragua under the heading Project Aurora. "Project Aurora," she read aloud. "Suspected biological research facility operating under civilian cover near Matagalpa region. Intelligence suggests possible weaponization of indigenous botanical compounds. Monitoring ongoing." The three exchanged grave looks as the implications set in. "Biological weapons," Marcus said quietly. "That's what Midnight Sun was about. Not extracting an intelligence asset, shutting down a bioweapons facility." "And Timberwolf could have been the intelligence gathering phase," Mitchell added, "identifying the facility, confirming what they were doing there." But why send in a SEAL team? Tanya asked. For a bioweapons threat. Wouldn't the CIA or some specialized unit be more appropriate? Deniability, Marcus answered. If something went wrong, which it did, they could disavow all knowledge. A SEAL team operating in Nicaragua during that period would have been a major international incident. Better to let one operator disappear than admit the U.S. was conducting covert operations in a politically sensitive region. But that still doesn't explain the American Keller supervising your interrogation, Mitchell pointed out. If the goal was deniability, why have CIA personnel directly involved with rebel forces? Marcus was silent for a moment, the pieces slowly coming together in his mind. Unless the facility wasn't just Soviet. What if we had our own operation there? What if Midnight Sun wasn't about shutting down a bioweapons lab but taking it over? The room fell silent as they considered this disturbing possibility. The Cold War had seen many morally questionable operations on both sides, and biological weapons research was a notoriously gray area in intelligence activities. We need more, Mitchell finally said. This is all circumstantial. Before you testify, we need something concrete connecting Keller to both the facility and the decision to abandon you. They worked through the night, following every lead, cross-referencing every scrap of information. By morning, exhaustion had set in, but they had constructed a timeline that connected Soviet biological research, American covert operations in Nicaragua, and the fateful mission that had left Marcus behind. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across Mitchell's living room, Marcus stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The weight of what they had discovered, of what it meant for his past and potentially for his future, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the envelope taped to the mailbox. His name, his real name, Marcus Washington, was typed on the front. No postmark, no return address. He removed it carefully, alert for any signs of tampering, then opened it to find a single photograph inside. The image showed Tanya leaving her apartment building the previous morning, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. On the back, a message was written in neat block letters. Some ghosts should stay dead. Marcus felt a cold rage building inside him. They had crossed a line, threatening his daughter. When he returned inside, his expression must have betrayed his emotions because both Mitchell and Tanya immediately tensed. "What happened?" Mitchell asked, rising from his chair. Wordlessly, Marcus handed him the photograph. Mitchell examined it, his face darkening. "They're watching us," he said grimly, "and now they're making threats." "Not threats," Marcus corrected. "Promises. They're telling me to back off or Tanya pays the price." Tanya took the photo, her face paling slightly before her jaw set in a determined line. "I'm not afraid," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "You should be," Marcus replied. "These people, they don't make empty gestures. If they're targeting you, they're serious." "So what do we do?" she asked. "Give up? Let them win?" Marcus shook his head. "No, we adjust. You need to go somewhere safe, somewhere they can't find you, at least until after the hearings." "I'm not leaving," Tanya insisted. "This is my fight too, Dad. Has been since the moment I learned what they did to you." "Tanya." "No," she cut him off. "I'm not that little girl you protected from the truth anymore. I'm a grown woman making my own choice, and I choose to stay." The determination in her eyes reminded Marcus so much of her mother that for a moment he couldn't speak. Pride and fear warred within him, pride at the strength of the woman his daughter had become, fear for what that strength might cost her. "We can take precautions," Mitchell intervened. "I have contacts, people who can provide security without drawing attention. And we should move our operation. This house isn't secure anymore." Marcus nodded, his tactical mind already assessing options. "We need a safe house. Somewhere off the grid, no paper trail." "I know a place," Mitchell said. Cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Belongs to a friend who owes me a favor. No rental records, no digital footprint. How soon can we move? Marcus asked. Today. Now. Mitchell was already gathering their most essential documents. We'll have to leave most of this behind, but I've digitized the critical files. They worked quickly, packing only what was absolutely necessary. Marcus insisted on driving separately, taking Tanya in his car while Mitchell followed. It was a security precaution. If they were being tracked, splitting up would make it harder to follow them both. As they drove west out of the city, Marcus kept a careful eye on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of surveillance. The dark sedan that had been parked near the diner was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. Men like Keller had resources, networks, methods that went beyond the obvious. Beside him, Tanya sat in silence for the first hour of the drive, staring out at the passing landscape. Finally, she spoke. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like? If Nicaragua hadn't happened, I mean. Marcus glanced at her, surprised by the question. Sometimes, he admitted. I'd probably have stayed in the Navy, completed my 20 years, maybe moved into training or special operations planning. Would you have had a family? Tanya asked. Besides me, I mean. The question stirred something deep inside him. Old dreams, long abandoned. Maybe. I was engaged once, before Nicaragua. Her name was Diane. We had plans. What happened to her? When I was declared dead, she mourned and eventually moved on. By the time I came back, she was married with a child on the way. Marcus's voice held no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance of what had been lost. It was better that way. The man who came back from Nicaragua, he wasn't the same man she had loved. Tanya reached over and squeezed his hand. I'm glad you found Mom, though, even if it was just for a little while. Marcus smiled faintly. So am I, baby girl. So am I. The cabin Mitchell had arranged was exactly what they needed. Remote, defensible, with good sightlines in all directions and multiple escape routes. It was rustic but comfortable, with a generator for power and a well for water. Most importantly, it was nearly invisible from the main road, tucked into a stand of pine trees halfway up a mountain slope. They spent the first day setting up their temporary command center. Laptops, documents, timelines pinned to the walls. Mitchell installed a satellite internet connection, ensuring they could continue their research and stay in contact with his sources. As night fell, they gathered around the cabin's small kitchen table, reviewing their strategy for the days ahead. The Senate hearing is in 7 days, Mitchell said. We need to focus on preparing your testimony, Marcus. What you'll say, what evidence you'll present. And what to leave out, Marcus added. We still don't have concrete proof connecting Keller to the decision to abandon me. Just circumstantial evidence and Rivera's testimony. Speaking of Rivera, Tanya said, should we bring him in, have him testify as well? Marcus shook his head. Too dangerous for him. He's already taken a huge risk by meeting with me. Besides, his testimony would just corroborate what we already know, that the mission was compromised from the start. So what's our approach? Mitchell asked. Marcus considered for a moment before answering. We focus on the facts we can prove. My deployment to Nicaragua as part of SEAL Team 6, the ambush, my capture and 18 months of imprisonment, my escape and return to the U.S. The forced change of identity and the classification of my service record. And Midnight Sun? Tanya asked. We present what we've found, the satellite imagery of the research facility, the declassified references to Project Aurora, the connections to Soviet bioweapons research. But we frame it as questions rather than accusations. Why was I sent to that region? What was the true purpose of the mission? Why was I abandoned and then erased? Mitchell nodded slowly. Put the burden on them to explain. I like it. There's something else, Marcus said, his expression serious. I want to meet with Keller before the hearing. Mitchell stared at him in disbelief. You want to what? Meet with Keller, face to face. That's suicide, Mitchell argued. He's already threatened Tanya. What makes you think he wouldn't just have you eliminated? Because that would raise too many questions now, Marcus explained. A man scheduled to testify before a Senate committee suddenly turning up dead? That would trigger exactly the kind of investigation they've been trying to avoid for 40 years. What would you hope to gain from meeting him? Tanya asked. Marcus's gaze was unwavering. The truth. Before I go before that committee, I want to hear from his own mouth why they left me to die in that jungle. Why they erased me when I made it back alive anyway. I want to look him in the eye when he tells me. Mitchell and Tanya exchanged concerned glances, but neither argued further. They recognized the resolve in Marcus's voice. This wasn't just about testimony or evidence or even justice. It was about closure, about finally confronting the man who had shaped the course of his life through decisions made in the shadows. How would you even arrange such a meeting? Mitchell finally asked. Marcus's response was simple. He's watching us. He has been from the start. All we need to do is let him know I want to talk. That night, as Tanya and Mitchell slept, Marcus sat on the cabin's porch, the cool mountain air filling his lungs. The stars above reminded him of those Nicaraguan nights, of the hope they had once represented when everything else had been taken from him. Tomorrow they would set in motion the final phase of their plan, the confrontation with Keller, the preparation for the Senate testimony, the culmination of a 40-year journey from abandoned operator to witness for the truth. Marcus touched the crescent-shaped scar on his forearm, tracing its familiar curve. Soon the world would know what it meant. Soon the man who had walked out of that jungle alone would finally complete his longest mission. And God help anyone who tried to stop him. Arranging a meeting with Richard Keller proved easier than expected. Mitchell had a contact at the Washington Post, a veteran journalist who had covered military affairs for decades. A single cryptic message delivered through this intermediary was all it took. Marcus Washington wishes to speak with the man who wore the red stone ring in Nicaragua. Neutral location. No recording devices. Tomorrow. By noon the next day they had a response, coordinates for a location in Rock Creek Park, and a time, 3 p.m. It's a trap, Mitchell insisted as they gathered around the cabin's kitchen table, plotting the meeting on a map. He could have a dozen men waiting. Possible, Marcus acknowledged, but unlikely. Keller's too smart for that. A retired SEAL found dead in a public park. That would raise exactly the kind of questions he wants to avoid. Still, you shouldn't go alone, Tanya argued. I won't be, Marcus assured her. Mitchell will be nearby, watching, but Keller will only speak freely if he believes I'm alone. They spent the morning preparing, not just for the meeting, but for the possibility that it might go wrong. Marcus selected clothing that would allow freedom of movement if necessary. Mitchell prepared surveillance equipment that would allow him to monitor the meeting from a distance. Tanya, despite her protests, would remain at the cabin, continuing their research and maintaining communication. The drive back to D.C. was tense, neither man speaking much. Marcus stared out the window, mentally preparing for the confrontation ahead. After 40 years, he would finally face the man who had observed his torture, who had been part of the system that abandoned him and then erased him, the man who now threatened his daughter. Rock Creek Park was busy with joggers and families enjoying the early summer weather. Marcus approached the designated meeting spot, a secluded bench overlooking the creek, exactly on time. Mitchell had positioned himself on a hiking trail about 200 yards away, close enough to observe through binoculars, but far enough to remain undetected. Marcus sat on the bench, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes scanning the surroundings without appearing to do so. Years of training never truly faded. He sensed rather than heard the approach from behind, the slight displacement of air, the almost imperceptible sound of expensive shoes on soft earth. He didn't turn. "Marcus Washington," a voice said, cultured, controlled, with the faint remnants of a New England accent. "The ghost of Nicaragua." Now Marcus turned, looking up at the man who had haunted his memories for decades. Richard Keller had aged well, tall and lean, his silver hair neatly styled, his suit impeccably tailored. He looked more like a distinguished diplomat than a man with blood on his hands. But his eyes, cold, calculating, assessing, revealed the truth. And on his right hand, just as Marcus remembered, was the gold ring with the red stone. "Keller," Marcus acknowledged, not rising from the bench. "Or is it sir? I never did catch your rank during our time together." Keller's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps that Marcus would reference their shared history so directly. He moved around the bench and sat, maintaining a careful distance. "We were never formally introduced," Keller said, his tone conversational. "Different circumstances." "Different indeed," Marcus agreed. "You were standing in the shadows while rebels tortured me for information about an operation I knew nothing about." Keller glanced around the park, ensuring no one was within earshot. "That's your recollection. I'm not here to confirm or deny past events." "Then why are you here?" "Professional courtesy. One government servant to another." Keller's thin smile held no warmth. "To advise you that the path you're on leads nowhere good, for you or your daughter." The threat was thinly veiled, but Marcus didn't react. "I'm testifying before the Senate committee in 6 days, Keller. Nothing you say or do will change that." "And what exactly do you plan to tell them?" Keller asked, his tone remaining even. "That you were part of an unauthorized military incursion into a sovereign nation during a period when such actions were explicitly prohibited by Congress. That would be admitting to a violation of federal law. The statute of limitations on that expired decades ago," Marcus countered. "Besides, we both know that's not what you're worried about." "Oh? And what am I worried about in your expert opinion?" Marcus turned to face Keller directly, his gaze unwavering. "Project Aurora, the bioweapons research facility 5 miles from the rebel compound. The real reason SEAL Team 6 was sent into Nicaragua, not to extract an asset, but to secure samples from the facility." Keller's expression remained neutral, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around his eyes, a tell that he'd struck close to the truth. "An interesting theory," Keller said after a moment. "Completely unfounded, of course, but creative. I have the satellite images, Keller. I have Rivera's notebook with the coordinates of the facility. I have declassified CIA reports mentioning Project Aurora and Soviet biological research in the region." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "What I don't have, yet, is the reason why a SEAL operator was abandoned, presumed dead, when his team could have come back for him." "Operational necessity," Keller replied, the words so cold, so devoid of humanity, that Marcus felt a surge of anger. "In any mission there are acceptable losses." "I wasn't a loss," Marcus said, his voice low and controlled. "I survived 18 months of captivity. I escaped. I made it back to U.S. soil, and instead of being debriefed properly, instead of receiving the medical and psychological care I needed, I was erased." "Why?" For the first time, Keller's composure slipped slightly. "You were a complication we couldn't afford. The Nicaragua operation was already problematic from an international law perspective. Having a surviving operator who had been captured by rebels with Soviet connections, the potential diplomatic incident alone would have been catastrophic." "So you buried me," Marcus concluded, gave me a new identity, swore me to secrecy, and hoped I'd just disappear into civilian life. And for 39 years you did exactly that, Keller pointed out. You adapted. You built a new life. You even started a family. His gaze grew pointed. A lovely daughter, Tanya, Princeton graduate, works in nonprofit, quite accomplished. The implication was clear. The threat still active. Marcus felt his hands clench involuntarily, but he kept his voice steady. I'm not here to negotiate, Keller. I'm here to tell you, face to face, that your threats won't work. I'm testifying. I'm telling my story. And if anything happens to my daughter, there won't be a hole deep enough for you to hide in. Keller studied him for a long moment, as if recalculating his assessment. You misunderstand me, Marcus. I'm not threatening your daughter. I'm offering you an opportunity. One last chance to walk away from this with your new life intact. And if I don't take it, then certain truths will emerge, truths that might be difficult for a devoted daughter to hear about her father. Marcus frowned, genuinely confused. What are you talking about? Keller reached into his jacket and withdrew a thin file, placing it on the bench between them. Did you ever wonder why you were selected for the Nicaragua mission? Why, out of all the SEAL Team 6 operators available, you were specifically requested? With a sense of foreboding, Marcus opened the file. Inside was a personnel record, his own but from before SEAL Team 6 from his early days in naval intelligence. Attached was a mission report he had never seen, dated 1982, detailing an operation in Guatemala, an operation he had no memory of participating in. What is this? Marcus demanded. I was never in Guatemala. But you were, Keller said softly. Operation Black Orchid, a joint CIA naval intelligence mission to eliminate a suspected communist insurgent leader, your first wet work assignment, if I recall correctly. Marcus stared at the document, a cold dread settling in his stomach. This is fabricated. I never conducted assassination operations. The file says otherwise, Keller replied, as do the witnesses we still have available to testify. How do you think your daughter would feel learning her father wasn't just a heroic SEAL operator, but an assassin who eliminated political targets for the CIA? The pieces suddenly connected in Marcus's mind. That's why I was chosen for Nicaragua. Not for my skills, but because I was expendable. Because if I was captured or killed, you could control the narrative about who I was and what I had done. Keller didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. These documents are forgeries, Marcus said, closing the file and handing it back. And even if they weren't, even if you convinced the world I was something I wasn't, it wouldn't change what happened in Nicaragua. It wouldn't justify abandoning an American serviceman. Perhaps not, Keller conceded. But it would certainly complicate your testimony. The committee would question your credibility, your motives. The public would see not a hero unjustly abandoned, but a compromised operative with a checkered past. He paused. And your daughter would see a father who wasn't what she thought he was. Marcus stood abruptly, towering over Keller. You've had 40 years to perfect your lies, Keller. But here's what you don't understand. I'm not testifying to clear my name or to be recognized as a hero. I'm testifying because the truth about what happened in Nicaragua needs to come out. Keller remained seated, looking up at Marcus with cold calculation. And what truth is that exactly? That American personnel were sent into a hostile nation under false pretenses. That when the mission went wrong, they were abandoned. That when one of them survived against all odds, he was silenced and erased. And that somewhere in all of this is a secret so damning that men like you are still trying to bury it 40 years later. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Two old warriors from different sides of the same shadowy battlefield. Then Keller stood, straightening his suit jacket with a practiced motion. "You have a choice to make, Marcus. Testify and lose everything, your reputation, your daughter's respect, possibly even your freedom if certain other operations come to light. Or walk away, continue your life as Michael Williams, and ensure Tanya remains safe and untroubled by the past." "That's no choice at all," Marcus replied. "That's the only choice you have," Keller countered, turning to leave. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "You survived Nicaragua because you were adaptable, because you knew when to fight and when to submit. I suggest you remember that lesson." As Keller walked away, Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at the threats, disgust at the manipulation, but also a strange sense of validation. Keller's desperation to stop his testimony confirmed that there was something crucial at stake, something worth uncovering no matter the personal cost. Mitchell joined him a few minutes later, having observed the meeting from his position on the trail. "What happened? What did he say?" Marcus handed him the file Keller had left behind. "He's trying to discredit me before I testify. Fabricated documents suggesting I was a CIA assassin before joining SEAL Team 6. Mitchell skimmed the file, his expression darkening. "This is textbook character assassination. If these documents were entered into the record—" "They won't be," Marcus said firmly, "because Keller made a mistake. He thought threatening my reputation, threatening how Tanya sees me, would be enough to silence me. He doesn't understand that some things matter more than how others perceive you." As they walked back to the car, Marcus pulled out his phone and called Tanya. When she answered, her voice was tense with worry. "Dad, how did it go?" "It went as expected," Marcus replied. "Keller threatened. I refused to back down. But he revealed something important. He's scared, Tanya. Scared enough to fabricate evidence against me." "What kind of evidence?" "It doesn't matter," Marcus said. "What matters is, we're on the right track. When we get back, we need to focus on the bioweapons angle. Project Aurora is the key to understanding what really happened in Nicaragua, and why they were willing to sacrifice a SEAL operator to keep it secret." The drive back to the cabin was filled with strategic planning. Mitchell made calls to his contacts seeking any additional information on Project Aurora or Soviet bioweapons research in Nicaragua. Marcus reviewed his planned testimony, adjusting it to account for the new information and potential challenges from Keller or his allies on the committee. But beneath the tactical discussions, a deeper current ran through Marcus's thoughts. For decades, he had lived with the pain of abandonment, with the knowledge that his country had deemed him expendable. Now, facing Keller, he had glimpsed something more disturbing, the possibility that he had been selected for the Nicaragua mission precisely because he was considered disposable. That night, as Mitchell worked on corroborating evidence and Tanya slept, Marcus sat alone on the cabin's porch staring at the stars. In 5 days, he would stand before the Senate committee and tell his story. Keller and his allies would do everything in their power to discredit him, to paint him as unreliable, perhaps even dangerous. But Marcus had faced worse odds in that Nicaraguan jungle. He had survived captivity, torture, and the long journey home, only to be erased by the very country he had served. Now, 40 years later, he would finally complete his mission. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. And for the first time since that helicopter had lifted off, leaving him behind to face the enemy alone, Marcus Washington felt something he had almost forgotten: the quiet certainty that comes with fighting on the right side of history. The next 3 days passed in a blur of intense preparation. Marcus, Mitchell, and Tanya worked relentlessly, corroborating evidence, refining testimony, and anticipating potential challenges from Keller's allies on the committee. They had moved their operation from the cabin to a small hotel outside D.C., rotating rooms daily as a security precaution. Mitchell's contacts had come through with additional information on Project Aurora, declassified fragments of reports, redacted communications, and one particularly valuable find, a former CDC scientist who had been part of a team sent to evaluate unspecified biological materials of foreign origin in late 1986. Dr. Eleanor Chen sat across from them in the hotel room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Though retired for over a decade, she carried herself with the precise posture of someone who had spent a lifetime in laboratories and government facilities. Her eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, moved between Marcus and Mitchell as she considered her words carefully. "I can't confirm the source of the materials we were asked to analyze," she began, her voice low but steady. "We were told only that they were obtained through standard intelligence channels. But the samples were unusual. Plant-based compounds with properties I had never seen before." "What kind of properties?" Tanya asked, taking notes on her laptop. Dr. Chen hesitated. "That information remains classified, I'm afraid. What I can tell you is that after our initial analysis, the entire project was suddenly transferred to a military research facility. My team was debriefed, sworn to secrecy, and reassigned to other projects. I never heard about the samples again, at least not officially." "And unofficially?" Marcus prompted. The scientist removed her glasses, polishing them with a cloth from her pocket, a gesture that seemed designed to give her time to consider her response. Rumors circulated. Colleagues in adjacent departments whispered about breakthrough applications in battlefield medicine and other, less humanitarian uses. One name kept coming up in these whispers: Midnight Sun. Marcus and Mitchell exchanged glances, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. "Did you ever hear the name Richard Keller associated with the project?" Mitchell asked. Dr. An Chen replaced her glasses, her expression guarded. "Not at the time, but years later, when I was serving on an international bioethics committee, I encountered him at a conference. He was introduced as a State Department advisor, but his questions during the sessions on biological warfare conventions were, well, let's say they suggested a deeper knowledge than most diplomats would possess." After Dr. Chen left, promising to provide written testimony if needed, the team gathered around the evidence board they had constructed on the hotel room wall. "So we have confirmation that biological materials were transferred from Nicaragua to U.S. research facilities in late 1986, right after the operation where Marcus was left behind," Mitchell summarized. "And these materials had potential military applications, both defensive and offensive." "Which would explain the extreme secrecy surrounding the mission," Tanya added. Biological weapons research was already a sensitive area due to international treaties. If word got out that the U.S. was harvesting potentially weaponizable biological compounds from Nicaragua, it would have been a diplomatic disaster, Marcus finished, not to mention a violation of multiple laws and treaties, certainly worth silencing a single SEAL operator to keep it quiet. The puzzle was coming together, but crucial pieces were still missing. How exactly had Marcus's team been used in this operation? Was retrieving biological samples the secondary objective mentioned in Rivera's notebook? And most importantly, who had made the decision to abandon Marcus rather than mount a rescue operation? The answers came from an unexpected source. That evening, as Marcus reviewed his testimony alone in the hotel room, his phone rang, an unlisted number. Cautiously, he answered, "Marcus Washington." The voice on the other end was weak, elderly, but the military bearing still evident in its tone. "It's James Schultz. We served together in Nicaragua." Marcus sat up straighter, his heart racing. Schultz, one of the 4 men he had stayed behind to save, the one Rivera had said was living off the grid in Alaska. "Schultz," Marcus acknowledged, his voice carefully neutral. "Rivera told me you were still alive." "Barely," Schultz replied, a rattling cough punctuating his words. Terminal lung cancer. Doctors give me a month, maybe less. I'm sorry to hear that, Marcus said, and meant it. Don't be. I've lived longer than I deserved. The bitterness in Schultz's voice was palpable. Rivera called me, said you're testifying before some Senate committee about Nicaragua, about what really happened. That's right. A long pause, filled only with Schultz's labored breathing. There are things you need to know, Washington, things I've kept quiet for 40 years. But with death staring me in the face, well, some secrets shouldn't die with me. Marcus reached for a notepad. I'm listening. The mission, it was compromised from the start, not just bad intel, deliberately compromised. Schultz's voice strengthened as he spoke, as if unburdening himself gave him renewed energy. There was no intelligence asset to extract, that was the cover story. The real mission was to secure biological samples from a research facility near the compound. Project Aurora, Marcus said. You know about that? Schultz sounded surprised. We've pieced some of it together, Marcus explained, but we don't know who compromised the mission or why. Schultz coughed again, a wet, painful sound. It was Keller. He was running a parallel operation with the rebels, some kind of exchange. We provide certain intelligence, they provide samples from the Soviet bioweapons research. But something went wrong. The rebels got suspicious, thought they were being double-crossed. So they set up an ambush, Marcus concluded, the pieces finally clicking into place. Exactly. They knew we were coming. Keller knew they knew. But he let us go in anyway, expendable assets in case the deal went south, which it did. The self-loathing in Schultz's voice was unmistakable. When you stayed behind to cover our extraction, Keller saw an opportunity. If you were captured, the rebels might believe you were the one trying to double-cross them. It would preserve his channel to the biological materials. Marcus gripped the phone tighter, a cold rage building inside him. And Commander Mitchell? Did he know about this? No, Schultz said firmly. Jack was a good man. When he realized what had happened, he fought like hell to get a rescue mission authorized. But Keller had pull with people even higher up the chain. The rescue was denied. You were declared KIA, and the whole operation was buried under so many classification levels that even mentioning it was enough to end a career. And you've kept this secret all these years, Marcus said. No accusation in his tone, just acknowledgement of a burden carried too long. What choice did I have? Schultz asked wearily. After Thompson died in that accident, after Miller's suicide, the message was pretty clear. Keep quiet or join them. So I disappeared to Alaska, tried to forget. But you don't forget something like that. You don't forget leaving a teammate behind. The guilt in his voice was raw, unhealed despite the decades that had passed. Marcus felt an unexpected surge of compassion for the dying man. You followed orders, Schultz. You didn't leave me. Keller did. The system did. Maybe, Schultz conceded, but I could have spoken up sooner. Could have tried to find you after you came back. Instead, I hid. You're speaking up now, Marcus pointed out. That counts for something. Another long pause, more labored breathing. There's something else you should know. About the samples, what they were used for. I've been tracking research publications, military medicine developments. Over the years, I've identified at least 7 drugs and treatments that I believe originated from those Nicaraguan compounds, some saving lives in combat hospitals, others less humanitarian applications. Can you document this? Marcus asked, his mind racing with the implications. Already have. Files encrypted, set to send to multiple news outlets upon confirmation of my death. But I'll send you a copy now. Use it however you need to. Marcus wrote down the details Schultz provided for accessing the encrypted file. As their conversation wound down, Schultz asked a question that caught Marcus off guard. Was it worth it, Washington? The sacrifice? The years lost? Marcus considered the question, thinking of the life that had been taken from him, but also of Tanya, of the good he had managed to do despite everything. "I'm still deciding," he answered honestly. "Ask me again after the hearing." Schultz gave a wheezing laugh that dissolved into coughing. "I might be asking from the other side by then, but I'll be watching, one way or another." His voice grew serious again. "Be careful, Marcus. Keller isn't the only one with something to lose if this comes out. There are others, powerful people who authorize the use of those biological compounds in ways that would shock the public." "I understand the risks," Marcus assured him. "I hope so," Schultz replied, "because they won't just come after you this time. They'll target anyone connected to you, your daughter, Mitchell, anyone helping you tell this story." After the call ended, Marcus immediately shared Schultz's information with Mitchell and Tanya. Mitchell looked grim as he processed the revelations. "This changes everything," he said. "With Schultz's testimony and the documentation he's providing, we can directly link Keller to the decision to abandon you. We can prove he deliberately sent your team into an ambush as part of a covert biological weapons acquisition operation, and that he sacrificed you to protect his asset channel with the rebels." Tanya added, her expression a mixture of horror and determination. "This is bigger than just what happened to you, Dad. This is about decades of potential violations of international law and human rights." Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of what they had uncovered settling on his shoulders. "Which means the stakes just got a lot higher. If Schultz is right about these compounds being used in military applications outside of proper protocols, then we're not just exposing what happened to one SEAL operator 40 years ago," Mitchell finished. "We're potentially exposing illegal bioweapons research that continued for decades afterward." The three fell silent, contemplating the magnitude of what lay ahead. The Senate hearing, originally intended to address historical wrongs and recognize forgotten sacrifices, now had implications that could reach into the highest levels of military and intelligence communities. That night, as Marcus tried to sleep, his phone chimed with an email notification. Schultz had sent the encrypted file as promised. The accompanying message was brief. "Use this wisely. Some fires, once started, can't be controlled. Godspeed, Phantom." Marcus lay awake until dawn, thinking about choices and consequences. For 40 years he had lived with the aftermath of decisions made by others, decisions that had altered the course of his life without his knowledge or consent. Now he held in his hands the power to expose those decisions, to bring their architects to account. But Schultz's warning echoed in his mind. Some fires, once started, can't be controlled. The hearing was now just 2 days away, and what had begun as a quest for personal justice had evolved into something far more complex and potentially far-reaching. As the first light of morning filtered through the hotel curtains, Marcus made a decision. He would testify as planned, but with a crucial adjustment to his strategy. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about accountability, about the limits of national security as justification for moral compromise, about the soldiers and operatives who might face similar situations in the future. Richard Keller and his allies had sacrificed Marcus Washington for what they deemed the greater good. Now, Marcus would ensure that their definition of greater good was exposed to the light of public scrutiny and congressional oversight. The next morning, as the team made final preparations, a breaking news alert flashed across Tanya's laptop. Former SEAL Team 6, commander found dead in Alaska home. James Schultz, their key witness, their source of crucial evidence, was gone. But his final act of courage, the encrypted file now in Marcus's possession, would ensure that the truth he had carried for 40 years would finally be heard. The morning of the Senate hearing arrived with a sense of inevitable confrontation. Marcus stood at the hotel window, watching the sunrise paint the Washington Monument in hues of gold and amber. He had slept little, spending most of the night reviewing his testimony and the evidence they had compiled. Schultz's encrypted file had proven even more valuable than they had hoped. Detailed documentation of the biological compounds recovered from Nicaragua, their transfer to military research facilities, and their subsequent development into various applications, some clearly violating international conventions on biological warfare. Tanya entered the room, already dressed in a conservative navy suit, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Ready?" she asked simply. Marcus nodded, turning from the window. "As ready as I'll ever be." Mitchell joined them in the lobby, his face grim. "Security's tight," he reported. "The committee room has been swept twice already. Press is gathered outside the building." "Any sign of Keller?" Marcus asked. "Not yet, but he'll be there," Mitchell replied with certainty. Too much at stake for him to stay away. The drive to Capitol Hill was tense, none of them speaking much. As they approached the Senate office building, Marcus noticed the increased security presence, Capitol Police stationed at entrances, plainclothes agents scanning the crowds, news vans lined the street, reporters doing live stand-ups with the imposing building as their backdrop. "Looks like word got out about the significance of today's testimony," Mitchell observed. Tanya checked her phone. Breaking news alerts started last night after Schultz's death. Someone leaked that a former SEAL would be testifying about classified Cold War operations and potential violations of international law. "Keller," Marcus said. "He's trying to control the narrative, get ahead of the story." They were met at a side entrance by a Senate aide who escorted them through security and into a small preparation room adjacent to the hearing chamber. Senator James Lawrence, the committee chairman, was waiting for them. A tall, distinguished man in his 60s with the erect posture of his Marine background. "Mr. Washington," he greeted Marcus, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I understand the personal risk you're taking by testifying today." Marcus shook the offered hand. "Thank you for the opportunity, Senator." Lawrence's expression was solemn. "I should warn you, there's been significant behind-the-scenes pressure to limit the scope of today's hearing. Several committee members have received calls from the Defense Department, CIA, and State Department urging restraint in questioning and caution regarding classified materials." "Keller's allies," Mitchell said. Lawrence nodded. "I can't control how other senators conduct their questioning, but as chairman I can promise you'll have the opportunity to tell your story fully. The American people deserve to know what happened to you and why." As the time for the hearing approached, Marcus could feel the familiar pre-mission focus settling over him. The clarity of purpose, the heightened awareness, the calm that comes from accepting all possible outcomes. This was, in many ways, his final mission, the culmination of a journey that had begun 40 years ago in the jungles of Nicaragua. The hearing room was packed when they entered. Committee members arranged behind the elevated dais, press corps filling the designated media area, public spectators in the gallery. And there, in the third row of observers, sat Richard Keller, flanked by two younger men with the unmistakable bearing of intelligence operatives. Their eyes met briefly across the room, Keller's expression impassive, revealing nothing. Senator Lawrence called the session to order, his deep voice resonating through the chamber. "This closed hearing of the Senate Special Committee on Classified Cold War Operations is now in session. Today, we will hear testimony from Marcus Washington, former member of SEAL Team 6, regarding a 1986 operation in Nicaragua and subsequent events." He turned to Marcus, who sat alone at the witness table, a microphone positioned before him. "Mr. Washington, please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?" "I do," Marcus replied, his voice steady and clear. Lawrence nodded. "Please proceed with your opening statement." Marcus took a deep breath, looking not at his prepared notes but directly at the committee members. "My name is Marcus Washington. In 1986, I was a senior operator with SEAL Team 6, deployed to Nicaragua as part of a classified mission codenamed Operation Bowstring. What was officially described as an asset extraction operation was, in reality, something very different. A covert attempt to acquire biological materials from a Soviet-sponsored research facility. A murmur ran through the room, several committee members exchanging glances. Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. During that operation, my team was ambushed. I stayed behind to cover their extraction, was captured by rebel forces, and spent 18 months in captivity before escaping. Upon my return to the United States, instead of receiving proper debriefing and support, I was given a new identity, sworn to secrecy, and effectively erased from official records. For the next 30 minutes, Marcus detailed his experiences, the mission, the ambush, the long months of captivity and interrogation, his escape, and the government's subsequent handling of his return. He spoke without emotion, presenting the facts clearly and concisely, but the power of his story was undeniable. Even those senators visibly skeptical at the beginning were leaning forward, fully engaged. When Marcus finished his initial testimony, Lawrence turned to the committee. "We'll now proceed with questions. Senator Harris, you're recognized for 5 minutes." Senator Harris, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, leaned toward her microphone. "Mr. Washington, your story is compelling, but I must ask, why come forward now after nearly 40 years of silence?" "Because the truth deserves to be known," Marcus replied simply. "Not just for my sake, but for the sake of accountability. The decisions made surrounding that operation, to send a team into an ambush, to abandon an American serviceman, to cover up what really happened, those decisions had consequences that extended far beyond one mission or one man." "What kind of consequences?" Harris pressed. Marcus reached for the folder containing documents from Schultz's encrypted file. "The biological materials acquired from Nicaragua, obtained at the cost of American lives and through methods that violated international law, were subsequently developed into various applications by U.S. military research facilities. Some of these applications saved lives in combat hospitals. Others—" He paused, then continued firmly. "Others violated the Biological Weapons Convention to which the United States is a signatory." The room erupted in murmurs and exclamations. Lawrence banged his gavel, calling for order. "Mr. Washington, those are serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support them?" "I do," Marcus confirmed, passing copies of the documents to the committee clerk for distribution. "These records, compiled by another member of my team who recently passed away, detail the transfer and development of biological compounds from Nicaragua over a period of decades. They include internal memos, research protocols, and test results that clearly indicate development of offensive biological capabilities under the codename Midnight Sun." As the senators received and began reviewing the documents, a new voice cut through the tension in the room. "Mr. Chairman, I must object to this line of testimony." All heads turned toward the source, Richard Keller, now standing in the observer section. Lawrence frowned at the interruption. "Sir, observers are not permitted to speak during committee proceedings." "My apologies, Senator," Keller replied smoothly. "But as a former State Department official with direct knowledge of the matters being discussed, I feel compelled to note that the witness is presenting information that remains highly classified. Continuing this discussion in an open setting, even a supposedly closed one, poses a significant risk to national security." Lawrence's expression hardened. "And you are?" "Richard Keller. I served as regional advisor for Central American Affairs during the period in question." Marcus watched the exchange with focused intensity, noting the way several committee members reacted to Keller's name, some with recognition, others with visible discomfort. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Mr. Chairman," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension, "Mr. Keller's presence here is actually quite relevant to my testimony, because Richard Keller wasn't just a State Department advisor. He was the CIA officer who deliberately sent my team into an ambush in Nicaragua as part of an unauthorized biological weapons acquisition program. He was the man who observed my interrogation by rebel forces. And he was the one who made the decision to abandon me rather than risk exposing Operation Midnight Sun." The room fell silent, all eyes moving between Marcus and Keller, who remained standing, his expression now carefully neutral. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Washington," Lawrence said. "Can you substantiate it?" "I can," Marcus replied. "In addition to the documentation I've provided, I have testimony from James Schultz, another member of my team who recently passed away. Before his death, he recorded a statement detailing Mr. Keller's role in compromising our mission and blocking subsequent rescue attempts." He nodded to Mitchell, who approached the clerk with a flash drive containing Schultz's video testimony. As arrangements were made to play the recording, Senator Reynolds, a known hawk with deep ties to intelligence communities, intervened. "Mr. Chairman, before we proceed further, I think we should consider moving to a more secure setting. These allegations, if true, touch on matters of the highest classification level." "With all due respect, Senator," Marcus countered, "classification has been used for 40 years to bury what happened in Nicaragua. I believe the American people have a right to know when their government abandons its servicemen and violates international law, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be." Lawrence considered this, then made his decision. "We'll continue in open session. Play the recording." Schultz's face appeared on the monitors throughout the room, gaunt from illness but his eyes bright with purpose. His voice, though weakened by disease, carried the unmistakable authority of first-hand knowledge as he detailed Keller's role in the Nicaragua operation, the deliberate compromise of the mission, and the subsequent cover-up. As the recording played, Marcus watched Keller's reaction. The former CIA officer remained outwardly composed, but there was tension in his jaw, a tightness around his eyes, the subtle tells of a man watching his carefully constructed narrative crumble. When the recording ended, Lawrence turned to Keller. "Mr. Keller, given the serious nature of these allegations, the committee would welcome your testimony, under oath, if you wish to respond." Keller straightened his tie, the gold ring with the red stone catching the light. "I would be happy to address these claims, Senator, though I must note that much of what I could say remains classified at the highest levels." "We'll make appropriate arrangements," Lawrence assured him. "Please come forward and be sworn in." As Keller made his way to the witness table, Marcus stood to move aside, but Lawrence stopped him. "Please remain seated, Mr. Washington. I believe it would be valuable to have both perspectives represented simultaneously." This was not standard committee procedure, and several members looked surprised, but none objected. Keller took the seat beside Marcus, maintaining a careful distance, his posture rigid with controlled tension. After Keller was sworn in, Lawrence began the questioning. "Mr. Keller, did you have operational authority over the 1986 Nicaragua mission involving Mr. Washington's SEAL team?" "I had an advisory role," Keller replied carefully. "Operational authority remained with military command structures." "That's not accurate," Marcus interjected. "Commander Mitchell received his orders directly from you, through a secure channel outside normal command protocols." Keller's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Washington wasn't privy to high-level operational planning. His perspective is necessarily limited. Yet he correctly identified you as present during his interrogation by rebel forces," Lawrence pointed out. "How do you explain that?" A flicker of discomfort crossed Keller's face before his composure returned. I was involved in various intelligence gathering operations throughout Central America during that period. My presence in certain locations doesn't confirm Mr. Washington's broader narrative. The questioning continued, growing increasingly pointed as the senators, emboldened by Schultz's testimony and the documentary evidence, pressed Keller on specific details of Operation Midnight Sun and the decision to abandon Marcus. Throughout the exchange, Marcus observed Keller with the trained eye of someone who had spent years reading people in high-pressure situations. He could see the former CIA officer's strategy: acknowledge what couldn't be denied, reframe what could be interpreted differently, and flatly reject what couldn't be directly proven. But as the hearing approached its third hour, that strategy began to falter under the weight of accumulated evidence and the skillful questioning of several committee members. When Senator Lawrence presented Keller with an internal memo bearing his signature, a document from Schultz's file authorizing the termination of recovery efforts for Marcus, the final facade cracked. "This document," Lawrence said, "explicitly states that continuing efforts to locate and recover Operator Washington posed an unacceptable risk to ongoing acquisition operations." "Can you explain what acquisition operations referred to, Mr. Keller?" Keller stared at the document, momentarily silent. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its polished control. "Senator, you have to understand the context of the Cold War. The Soviets were developing capabilities that could have drastically altered the strategic balance. We had intelligence suggesting the facility in Nicaragua was producing biological compounds with significant military potential. Difficult decisions had to be made." "Decisions to abandon American servicemen?" Lawrence pressed. "Decisions to prioritize national security over individual considerations," Keller countered, a hint of defiance entering his tone. "Everything we did was authorized at the highest levels. The materials obtained through Operation Midnight Sun contributed to defensive capabilities that have protected American lives for decades, and offensive capabilities that violated international law," Marcus added quietly. Keller turned to face him directly for the first time. "You have no idea what was at stake, Washington. None. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." "And you decided I was an acceptable sacrifice," Marcus said, his voice level but intense. "Not just my life, but the truth about what happened. You buried it all: the mission, the ambush, the 18 months I spent in captivity. You erased me when I was captured, and you tried to erase me again when I made it back alive." The room had fallen completely silent. The confrontation between the two men, the abandoned operator and the spy who had left him behind, holding everyone transfixed. "Yes," Keller finally said, his voice barely audible. "Yes, I did, and I would make the same decision again, under the same circumstances. Some things are bigger than one man." The admission hung in the air, its implications rippling through the hearing room. Senator Lawrence, recognizing the moment's significance, called for a 30-minute recess. As the committee members filed out, reporters rushed from the room to file their stories, and spectators buzzed with shocked conversations. Marcus remained seated, his eyes still locked with Keller's. "You got what you wanted," Keller said quietly. "Congratulations. But you have no idea what you've set in motion." "I know exactly what I've set in motion," Marcus replied. "Accountability, truth, the things that should have happened 40 years ago." As they stood to leave the witness table, Keller leaned closer, his voice for Marcus's ears alone. "They'll call you a hero for this, Washington. But remember, heroes often end up as martyrs." The threat was clear, but Marcus felt no fear, only a grim determination. "Better a martyr than a ghost, Keller. I've been dead once already. I'm not afraid of it happening again." The final hours of the Senate hearing unfolded with the intensity of a courtroom drama. After the recess, Keller returned with legal counsel, a sharp-featured woman who passed him notes and whispered in his ear as questioning resumed. But the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Keller's admission, however qualified, had opened a floodgate that no legal maneuvering could close. Senator Lawrence steered the proceedings with the precision of someone who understood both the political and human dimensions at stake. Additional documents from Schultz's files were entered into the record, along with Dr. Chen's testimony about the biological materials. By day's end, the committee had voted unanimously to establish a special prosecutor to investigate the full scope of Operation Midnight Sun and all subsequent activities related to the biological compounds obtained from Nicaragua. As Marcus left the hearing room, flanked by Mitchell and Tanya, they were met by a barrage of camera flashes and shouted questions from reporters. The story had broken wide open, leading every news broadcast and website. "Abandoned SEAL testifies Cold War bioweapons program exposed," read one headline. "40-year cover-up revealed in Senate hearing," proclaimed another. Marcus avoided the press, letting Mitchell handle the brief statements while they made their way to a waiting car. As they drove away from Capitol Hill, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the hearing began to ebb, leaving him drained but clear-headed. "You did it, Dad," Tanya said softly, taking his hand. "They can't bury the truth anymore." "We did it," Marcus corrected, squeezing her hand. "I couldn't have done this without you and Mitchell." Mitchell, watching the streets carefully as he drove, nodded in acknowledgement. "It's just the beginning, though. Keller has powerful allies. They'll fight back, try to control the narrative, limit the damage." "Let them try," Marcus replied, his voice weary but determined. "The truth is out there now. It has a life of its own." They spent that night in a secure location, a safe house arranged by Senator Lawrence, who had taken a personal interest in ensuring Marcus's security. News coverage of the hearing dominated every channel, with analysts and former intelligence officials weighing in on the revelations. Some defended the actions as necessary Cold War measures. Others condemned the abandonment of an American serviceman and the violation of international conventions. Through it all, Marcus watched with a strange detachment, as if observing events involving someone else. For 40 years, his story had been a burden he carried alone. Now it belonged to the world, to history, to the complex calculations of national memory and accountability. The next morning brought news that Richard Keller had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. By afternoon, reports emerged that federal agents had raided offices at the Defense Department and CIA, securing documents related to Project Aurora and Midnight Sun. The machinery of government oversight, once engaged, moved with surprising speed. A week after the hearing, Marcus received a call from Senator Lawrence. "The committee's preliminary report will be released tomorrow," Lawrence told him. "I wanted you to hear it from me first. We're recommending a full restoration of your military record, back pay and benefits for all the years you were listed as KIA, and the Distinguished Service Cross for your actions in Nicaragua." "Thank you, Senator," Marcus said, though the recognition felt almost irrelevant now, like receiving a long-delayed letter addressed to someone he used to be. "There's more," Lawrence continued. "The President would like to meet with you privately before making a public statement about your case and the broader implications of the committee's findings." The meeting took place 2 days later in the Oval Office, a surreal culmination to Marcus's journey. The President, a former Navy officer himself, listened intently as Marcus recounted his experiences once more, asking thoughtful questions about his captivity and the years that followed. "What happened to you represents a failure of our most sacred obligations," the President said finally. "As Commander-in-Chief, I can't undo the past, but I can ensure that your service and sacrifice are properly acknowledged and that the systems that allowed this to happen are reformed." The formal ceremony came a month later, a small, dignified affair at the Pentagon rather than the public spectacle Marcus had dreaded. His military record was officially corrected, his real identity restored after decades of living as Michael Williams. The Distinguished Service Cross was presented by the Secretary of Defense, with Tanya beaming proudly in the front row and Mitchell standing at attention nearby. Most meaningful to Marcus, however, was the presence of Carlos Rivera, who had traveled from his home in Arizona to witness the long overdue recognition of his former teammate. After the ceremony, the two men embraced, 4 decades of unspoken guilt and gratitude passing between them without words. Thompson and Miller would have been proud, Rivera said as they parted. Schultz, too. They never forgot you, Phantom. None of us did. In the months that followed, Marcus adjusted to a new reality, one where his past and present were finally aligned, where he could speak openly about his service without fear of repercussions. He agreed to a series of interviews with a respected military historian, ensuring that the full story would be preserved for future generations. The special prosecutor's investigation proceeded methodically, each new revelation confirming what Marcus had testified to and uncovering additional layers to the conspiracy. Midnight Sun had indeed been a decades-long program to develop both defensive and offensive biological capabilities from the Nicaraguan compounds, operating in the shadows of legitimate medical research. Keller was indicted on multiple charges, including obstruction of justice and violations of international law. Several former officials were implicated as well, though many had died in the intervening years. The case promised to wind through the courts for years to come, a slow but inexorable process of accountability. For Marcus, however, justice had already been served in the most meaningful way, through acknowledgement of the truth, restoration of his identity, and the reforms being implemented to prevent similar abandonment of service members in the future. 1 year to the day after his Senate testimony, Marcus stood at Arlington National Cemetery, placing flowers at the empty grave that had borne his name for nearly 4 decades. The headstone had been removed months ago, but he had wanted to visit the site one last time, a gesture of farewell to the ghost he had been. "Thought I might find you here," a voice said from behind him. Marcus turned to see Mitchell approaching, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying himself with military precision as always. "Just saying goodbye," Marcus explained as Mitchell joined him. "To what?" Marcus gestured to the empty plot. "To the man who didn't make it out of Nicaragua, to the years spent in shadows." Mitchell nodded in understanding. "Have you heard the latest? The President is establishing a commission to review all cases of service members declared KIA under classified circumstances. Already identified 3 other operators who may have been abandoned in similar situations." "Good," Marcus said simply. "No one should have to fight their way back from the dead alone." They walked together through the cemetery, past rows of white headstones that stretched to the horizon, a testament to sacrifice both acknowledged and anonymous. "What will you do now?" Mitchell asked as they neared the exit. "The book offers must be pouring in. Speaking engagements too." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'm not interested in becoming a celebrity. I've had enough attention to last several lifetimes." He paused, considering. Tanya's nonprofit works with veterans struggling to access benefits and recognition. They could use someone who knows how to navigate the system, who understands what it means to fight for acknowledgement. "Sounds perfect," Mitchell agreed, "and the Navy SEAL Museum reached out to me again. They're creating an exhibit on classified Cold War operations, including Nicaragua. They'd like your input on how to present the story accurately." "I'll think about it," Marcus promised. As they parted ways at the cemetery gates, Marcus felt a sense of completion he had never expected to experience. The burden he had carried for so long had been set down at last, not through forgetting but through the healing power of truth acknowledged and wrongs named. That evening, he sat with Tanya on the porch of his small house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. They had fallen into a comfortable routine in the months since the hearing, dinner together twice a week, phone calls almost daily, a closeness that had been missing during the years when his secrets had created an invisible barrier between them. "I got a call from a veterans group in Boston today," Tanya said, sipping her coffee. "They're establishing a support program specifically for operators from classified missions who struggle with the constraints of secrecy and non-disclosure. They want to name it after you." Marcus shook his head, amused. "Tell them to name it after Schultz, or Thompson and Miller. They paid a higher price than I did." "I'll suggest it," Tanya promised. She hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered between them since the Senate hearing. "Do you regret any of it? Coming forward, testifying, everything that followed?" Marcus considered the question, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the horizon. "No," he said finally. "For 40 years, I lived as someone else, carrying a truth no one was allowed to hear. Whatever comes next, good or bad, at least I'm living as myself on my own terms." Tanya smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Marcus Washington has a nice ring to it." "It does," he agreed, feeling the simple joy of hearing his real name spoken casually without fear or secrecy. Later that night, after Tanya had gone home, Marcus stood before the bathroom mirror, his sleeve rolled up to reveal the crescent-shaped scar on his forearm. For decades he had hidden it, a mark that could have identified him, exposed him, endangered him. Now it was simply part of his story, a physical reminder of a chapter that no longer needed to be concealed. The Navy SEAL who had received the scar during a training exercise in 1983. The operator who had stayed behind in Nicaragua to ensure his teammates' escape. The prisoner who had endured 18 months of captivity without breaking. The survivor who had found his way home only to be erased from official records. The father who had built a life worth living, despite everything that had been taken from him. All of these identities, once fragmented by necessity and circumstance, had finally been reconciled into a single, whole person. Marcus Washington. The next morning, Marcus walked into a coffee shop near his home, the same one he had frequented for years as Michael Williams. The young barista, who knew him as a regular, looked up with her usual smile. "Morning, the usual." Marcus shook his head. "Not today. I think I'll try something different." "Sure thing," she replied. "Can I get a name for the order?" Marcus smiled, feeling the simple power of truth after decades of necessary lies. "Marcus," he said. "My name is Marcus." As he waited for his coffee, he noticed a young man in navy dress blues at a corner table, studying what appeared to be technical manuals. Something in the sailor's focused expression, in the way he held himself, reminded Marcus of his own younger days, the dedication, the sense of purpose, the willingness to serve. The young man looked up, noticing Marcus's attention. Recognizing the look of a fellow serviceman, he offered a respectful nod, which Marcus returned. In that small exchange between strangers, one at the beginning of his journey, one near the end of his, Marcus felt the continuity of service that connected generations of those who wore the uniform. His coffee arrived, his real name called out in a public place without fear or hesitation for the first time in 40 years. As Marcus stepped out into the morning sunlight, he felt not the weight of the past but the freedom of the present. A man finally recognized, a veteran finally acknowledged, a story finally told. The mark on his arm, once a secret, was now a symbol of survival against impossible odds. And somewhere in Washington, the truth about Operation Midnight Sun continued to unfold, ensuring that other forgotten operators might someday step out of the shadows and into the light of recognition they had earned through their service and sacrifice. For Marcus Washington, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.